It began at the very edge of belief, the place where momentum finally outruns reality. Selles sat quietly in the Belgian countryside, a small village surrounded by rolling ground and narrow roads that curved through winter fields and low forests. In ordinary times, it was a place you passed through without thinking, a name on a signpost, a cluster of stone houses pressed close against the cold. But in the closing days of December 1944, Selles became something far larger than itself. It became the point where ambition stopped, where fuel ran out, where speed turned into stillness, where the German Ardennes Offensive reached its furthest breath and could go no farther. The German advance had come a long way to reach this place, through forests choked with snow, along roads never meant to carry so much steel, past villages burned into silence, past wrecked vehicles frozen where engines had died. Each mile westward had been paid for in fuel, time, and lives, and by the time German armored units approached Chelles, all three were running dangerously low. The landscape around the village told the story before a shot was fired. Fields were scarred with track marks cut deep into frozen earth. Roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles pulled aside and camouflaged with branches in futile hope. Snow lay uneven, churned gray and brown where men had marched, fought, fallen, and moved on. The air smelled faintly of smoke and oil, the scent of machines pushed too far. German armor reached the outskirts of Selles, not as a unified spearhead, but as fragments. Tanks arrived in small groups, crews exhausted, commanders improvising routes that barely existed. Orders were confused, maps were outdated, radio contact was unreliable, fuel gauges hovered near empty. The offensive still lived on paper, but on the ground it was already unraveling. And still, they pushed forward, because Selles mattered. Beyond it lay crossings over the Meuse. Beyond it lay the possibility, however thin, that the gamble might still work. Beyond it lay the illusion that momentum could be recovered if one more push succeeded. But the Allies had not been standing still. As German units crept toward Selles, American and British forces were already closing in. From the south, Patton's Third Army surged northward, hardened by winter roads and driven by urgency. From the north and west, British armor moved with deliberate precision, sealing escape routes and tightening pressure. The battlefield around Selles began to narrow, not suddenly, but steadily, like a door closing without drama. When the fighting began, it was sharp and decisive. Allied artillery found its targets quickly. Shells slammed into roads choked with armor that could not disperse. Tanks burned where they stood, their fuel igniting into towering flames that lit the winter sky. Infantry advanced cautiously, using the terrain with discipline learned through months of hard fighting, the Bauer. Germans tried to maneuver, to reposition, to counterattack, but movement required fuel, and fuel no longer existed. Every decision became heavier. Should tanks be held and fought as static guns? Should they be abandoned to save crews? Should a breakout be attempted under fire with no guarantee of success? The answers came too late. As Allied forces closed in, the Battle of Selles became a struggle defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by containment. German units found themselves trapped in pockets of ground they could not leave. Roads leading east were cut. Villages once passed through quickly now became obstacles. The terrain that had hidden the advance now exposed the retreat. Snow fell again, softly, indifferently. It settled on burning wreckage, on frozen bodies, on abandoned equipment that would never move again. Inside Selles, civilians hid in basements as explosions shook stone walls overhead. The village absorbed the noise and fear without choice, becoming a final stage for a battle it never invited. Tanks fired from positions between houses. Infantry moved through gardens and courtyards. Smoke drifted through streets that had known peace only days before. For German forces, Chelles marked the moment when hope became survival. For the Allies, it marked opportunity. British armor struck with coordination and patience. American units pressed forward relentlessly, cutting off escape routes and collapsing resistance piece by piece. The fighting was intense but brief, not because the Germans lacked will, but because they lacked options. The offensive had burned itself out, and Chelles was where the flame finally went dark. When the battle ended, the silence felt different. It was not the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of conclusion. The German Ardennes Offensive had reached its maximum extent and failed. What followed would be retreat, encirclement, and collapse across the Bulge. The war in the West had crossed a threshold from uncertainty to inevitability. And that shift could be traced directly to the frozen fields around this small Belgian village. Clever planning had not saved the offensive. Bravery had not saved it. Speed had not saved it. Reality had caught up. The Battle of Chenogne mattered because it was the end of illusion. It revealed that no matter how bold the plan, no matter how fierce the attack, momentum without supply cannot survive. It showed how modern war is decided not only by courage and firepower, but by logistics, timing, and restraint. Tonight, we return to that final push, to the roads that led nowhere, to the tanks that ran dry within sight of their goal, to the moment when westward movement finally stopped, to Celles, where the Ardennes Offensive reached its furthest point and the future turned against it. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late and still, or does the night feel restless? And one final, gentle invitation for tonight. If these long journeys through the quiet turning points of history help you slow down, reflect, or find meaning in understanding how things truly end, consider subscribing and stay with these stories when the world grows quiet. December 24th, 1944. 3 o'clock in the morning. The Ardennes forest sleeps under fresh snow, silent except for the grinding of steel tracks on frozen earth. Major Ernst von Boom peers through the vision port of his Panther tank, watching moonlight dance across the gun barrel ahead of him. They have been driving for 8 days, straight through American lines, through burning villages, past abandoned equipment and prisoners stumbling rearward. Now, in the darkness before Christmas morning, his reconnaissance battalion crosses the Orthe River near Rochefort, water splashing against the hull, as the tank lurches up the opposite bank. Von Boom checks his fuel gauge by the dim red light of the instrument panel. 40 kilometers of range remaining. The Meuse River lies 15 kilometers ahead. This is the spearhead of Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West. 2 weeks ago, 410,000 German soldiers erupted from the Ardennes forests in a surprise winter offensive that caught 3 American divisions completely off guard. The goal was audacious to the point of fantasy: drive 125 miles through Allied lines, recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies in half, and force a separate peace that would allow Germany to turn all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the east. Von Bohm's unit, the 2nd Panzer Division, was assigned the most critical objective of all: seize the bridges over the Meuse River at Dinant, cross to the western bank, open the road to Antwerp for the follow-on forces. It was the same mission, on the same river, that the 2nd Panzer Division had accomplished with stunning success in May of 1940, when they shattered French defenses and changed the course of World War II. 4.5 years later, they were being asked to perform the miracle again. But something has gone terribly wrong. Von Boom's fuel gauge tells only part of the story. Behind his reconnaissance battalion, the main body of 2nd Panzer Division is scattered across 90 kilometers of narrow forest roads, many vehicles already abandoned where they ran dry. The infantry that was supposed to accompany them never arrived, caught in traffic jams and American counterattacks miles to the rear. His radio crackles with fragmentary reports: American artillery hitting supply columns, bridges blown behind them, towns they bypassed yesterday now reoccupied by enemy forces. Von Boom's 600 men and 40 operational tanks are alone, deep in enemy territory, racing toward an objective they may no longer have the strength to hold even if they reach it. The order from division headquarters was clear and desperate: push to the Meuse regardless of fuel state, capture fuel from American depots if possible. Above all, reach the river before Allied reinforcements can block the crossings. As dawn breaks over the village of Chenogne, population 300, Von Boom's lead tanks roll down the main street past shuttered houses and a stone church with a tall spire. There is no resistance, no American troops, no roadblocks. His men dismount, weapons ready, moving from house to house, but find only terrified Belgian civilians hiding in their cellars. The reconnaissance officer climbs the church tower with binoculars and scans westward toward Dinant. He can see the valley of the Meuse in the distance, morning mist rising from the river. He can also see something else: vehicle traffic moving on the roads to the west, to the north, military columns converging from multiple directions. Von Boom receives the report and makes a quick calculation. They are 5 kilometers from Dinant as the crow flies, perhaps 7 by the winding road. They have fuel enough for 10 tanks to reach the river, but not enough to return. More critically, there are Allied forces already moving to cut them off. Von Boom makes his decision. He orders his tanks into defensive positions around Chenogne, using the village buildings for cover, placing the remaining Panthers where they can cover the approaches from north and west. His mechanics work frantically to siphon fuel from immobilized vehicles to keep a few tanks operational. Radio operators try to reach division headquarters, but the signals are weak and intermittent. By mid-morning on Christmas Eve, the fog begins to lift. For the first time in 8 days, the sky clears. Von Boom hears it before he sees it, the growing rumble of aircraft engines. American fighter bombers appear over the horizon, circling like predators that have spotted wounded prey. The first bombs fall on German supply columns trying to reach Chenogne from the east. Black smoke rises into the winter sky. Von Boom realizes with cold certainty that his battalion has just driven into a trap of their own making. They are the furthest German penetration of the entire Ardennes Offensive, tantalizingly close to their objective, and now they are about to be cut off and destroyed. What happened in the next 36 hours would mark the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge, though history would largely forget it. This was not the heroic siege of Bastogne that would capture headlines and inspire movies. This was something more revealing and more final. The moment when Germany's most elite armored division, veterans of 3 years of the Eastern Front, pushing forward with the skill and determination that had once made them legendary, discovered that skill and determination were no longer enough. The industrial might of the United States, the careful positioning of British reserves, and the invisible but decisive shortage of fuel would combine to transform their deepest advance into their graveyard. In the church tower at Chenogne, the reconnaissance officer continued scanning with his binoculars, counting the vehicles moving in the distance. British tanks, American trucks, artillery being emplaced on the ridgelines. He descended the ladder and reported to Von Boom. They were surrounded on 3 sides, with only a narrow corridor to the east still open, and that corridor was under artillery fire. On Christmas morning, 1944, the men of Kampfgruppe von Boom faced a grim reality. They had accomplished something extraordinary, driving 90 kilometers through enemy lines in 8 days, overrunning American positions, bypassing Bastogne, reaching closer to the Meuse River than any other German unit in the offensive. They had done everything asked of them, except the one thing that mattered. They had not crossed the river. They had not opened the road to Antwerp. They had not changed the strategic situation. And now, as British and American forces closed in from 3 directions, they would pay the price for their success. The fuel gauge that Major von Boom had checked by red light 8 hours earlier now read empty. 40 kilometers of range had become 0. The tanks that had carried them through Belgium now sat immobile, transformed from weapons into steel coffins. Some crews would later claim they could see the Meuse River bridges from Cellai's church tower, though this was likely imagination or hope rather than reality. What they definitely could see was the end of Hitler's last offensive in the West. The story of how 2nd Panzer Division reached Cellai's and what happened when Allied forces arrived to destroy them reveals something fundamental about the final year of World War II in Europe. It was no longer a question of German tactical skill against Allied numbers. It was no longer a matter of superior German tanks against inferior American Shermans. It was a question of oil against empty tanks, of supply chains that worked against supply chains that didn't, of air forces that could fly against air forces grounded by lack of fuel. The Battle of Chenogne lasted 32 hours of intense combat between December 26th and 27th. When it ended, 82 German tanks and assault guns lay destroyed or captured in the fields around a small Belgian village. 450 German soldiers surrendered. Approximately 20 escaped on foot through the Allied cordon. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had begun the offensive with 88 tanks, ceased to exist as a combat-effective formation. The furthest point of the German advance became the point of their most complete tactical defeat. But on that Christmas Eve morning in 1944, as Major von Boom positioned his Panthers around Chenogne and his men dug foxholes in frozen ground, the ending was not yet written. Radio messages still spoke of relief columns advancing from the east. Officers still studied maps, planning how they might resume the advance if fuel arrived. soldiers still believed that the same determination that had carried them 90 kilometers might carry them the final 5. They had no way of knowing that 60 kilometers to their west, British tank crews were loading ammunition and starting engines. They could not yet hear the rumble of American armor moving east from Havelange. They did not know that the weather clearing above them meant Allied fighter bombers could now hunt at will across the entire battlefield. For a few more hours, they could still imagine that the offensive might succeed. That imagination would die in the snow and fire of the next 2 days, taking with it Hitler's last hope of changing the course of the war. The ghost of what might have been would haunt the fields around Celle for decades to come, remembered not for what happened there, but for what came so close to happening and didn't. The village of Celle sits today as it did then, a small farming community of a few dozen buildings clustered around a church. Visitors who know where to look can find a modest memorial to the battle, maintained by local Belgian civilians and a handful of military history enthusiasts. Most travelers pass through without noticing, unaware that this quiet crossroads once marked the high-water mark of Nazi Germany's final offensive in Western Europe. The tanks are long gone, hauled away for scrap metal in the years after the war. The foxholes have been plowed under, the shell craters filled and planted with crops. Only the church remains as it was, its tower offering the same view that the German reconnaissance officer had on Christmas morning. Rolling farmland, the road westward toward Dinant, and in the distance, if you know where to look, the valley of the Meuse River. 5 kilometers away, close enough to see, too far to reach. The distance that measured the difference between Hitler's fantasy and historical reality. December 11th, 1944. Deep beneath the forests of Western Germany, in a concrete bunker complex called Adlerhorst, the Eagle's Eyrie, Adolf Hitler stands before a large map of Belgium and Luxembourg. His hands shake with the tremor that has worsened in recent months, a combination of Parkinson's disease, stress, and the accumulated effects of the medications his personal physician injects daily. But his voice is firm as he addresses the assembled field marshals and generals of the Wehrmacht. What he is about to reveal has been kept secret from even his highest commanders until this moment. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, the codename deliberately chosen to suggest a defensive operation, disguising its true nature as the most ambitious German offensive since 1940. 3 armies, 410,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 4,000 artillery pieces. Everything Germany has left in the West, stripped from defensive positions along the Rhine, pulled from training grounds, scraped together from reserves that barely exist anymore, all of it aimed at a single, audacious objective: recapture Antwerp. The logic, as Hitler explains it, has a certain desperate coherence. The Western Allies depend entirely on Antwerp for supply. The massive Belgian port, captured intact in September, has been laboriously cleared of mines and brought into operation, now handling more tonnage than any other port in Europe. Without Antwerp, the British and American armies would be reduced to a trickle of supplies coming through Cherbourg and the artificial Mulberry harbors on the Normandy coast, insufficient to maintain offensive operations. If German forces could drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and reach Antwerp in 7 days as planned, they would split the British 21st Army Group from the American forces to the south, surround and destroy 4 Allied armies, and force Eisenhower to negotiate. At minimum, it would buy Germany time to turn its full strength east against the Soviet winter offensive that intelligence predicted for January. At best, it might drive Britain out of the war entirely, leaving America isolated and possibly willing to accept a negotiated peace. This was not merely military planning. This was Hitler gambling everything on one final roll of the dice, believing he could repeat the miracle of May 1940 when his panzers had shattered French and British armies in 6 weeks. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, listens to Hitler's briefing with growing alarm. Model is one of Germany's most capable defensive tacticians, a specialist in fighting withdrawals and counterattacks, nicknamed the Führer's Fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing front lines. He has been given command of this offensive, but he had no role in planning it. The plan came directly from Hitler and the OKUB, the Armed Forces High Command, largely bypassing the experienced staff officers who might have identified its fatal flaws. Model studies the map and makes quick mental calculations. The offensive requires reaching the Meuse River, 125 kilometers away, in 48 hours. This assumes ideal road conditions, no serious resistance, and capturing American fuel depots along the way to sustain the advance. It assumes Allied air forces will remain grounded by bad weather for at least a week. It assumes American forces in the Ardennes sector are as weak as intelligence estimates suggest. It assumes Germany can actually deliver the fuel and ammunition promised for the operation when every previous offensive in the past year has run dry long before reaching its objectives. Model waits until the formal briefing ends, then requests a private word with Hitler. In the Führer's underground office, he speaks bluntly in a way few generals still dare. Mein Führer, this plan doesn't have a damned leg to stand on. The objectives are too ambitious, the logistics impossible, the timetable fantasy. If the goal is to disrupt Allied operations, Model proposes an alternative. A limited offensive aimed at destroying American forces in the Ardennes and recapturing the Roer River dams, which would delay Eisenhower's planned January offensive into Germany. This is achievable with the forces available. Reaching Antwerp is not. Hitler listens with the stony face he has shown increasingly to pessimistic military advice. When Model finishes, Hitler responds with a history lesson about Frederick the Great, who faced impossible odds in the 7 Years' War, yet prevailed through bold action when his generals counseled caution. Germany is in a similar position now, surrounded by enemies, facing inevitable defeat unless something dramatic changes the strategic calculus. The Ardennes offensive will be that something. The meeting ends with Model's objections overruled and his orders confirmed. Attack on December 16th, reach the Meuse in 2 days, take Antwerp in a week. The gulf between Hitler's vision and battlefield reality can be measured in fuel. Germany's synthetic fuel production, built up over years to compensate for lack of natural oil fields, depended on massive industrial plants converting coal into gasoline. Allied strategic bombing had systematically destroyed these facilities throughout 1944. In May of that year, Germany produced 316,000 tons of fuel. By December, production had collapsed to 17,000 tons, a 95% reduction. The entire Wacht am Rhein operation required 15 million liters of fuel to reach its objectives. German logistics officers calculated they could actually deliver 4.5 million liters to forward positions before the offensive began, with perhaps another million liters following in the first week. If roads remained open and American interdiction was light, this meant the attack would begin with less than one-third the fuel needed to complete the mission. The solution, as presented to field commanders, was simple and absurd. Capture American fuel depots during the advance. Specifically, planners identified 3 large American supply points that, if seized intact, would provide enough gasoline to continue the offensive. This transformed Operation Wacht am Rhein from a military offensive into a fuel raid on a massive scale, where success depended on the enemy obligingly leaving full fuel dumps in the path of German spearheads. The tank commanders who would lead the advance understood the implications, even if Hitler chose to ignore them. The Panther tanks of 2nd Panzer Division consumed approximately 2 liters of fuel per kilometer under combat conditions, more if the terrain was difficult or the weather cold. Each Panther carried 700 liters in internal tanks, giving a theoretical range of 350 kilometers. In practice, allowing for combat maneuvering, mechanical problems, and keeping a reserve, the operational range was closer to 200 kilometers. The distance from the assembly areas east of the Aar River to Antwerp was 300 kilometers. Even under ideal conditions, with no combat and perfect roads, the Panthers would need to refuel at least once. Under combat conditions, racing through enemy territory on narrow forest roads in winter, they would need fuel every 60 to 80 kilometers. The mathematics were inescapable and damning. Without captured American fuel, the offensive would stall somewhere short of the Meuse River, perhaps within sight of the bridges it needed to cross. With captured fuel but any significant delays, it would stall before reaching Antwerp. Only with captured fuel, minimal resistance, and speed matching the 1940 Blitzkrieg could it possibly succeed. Yet despite these obvious problems, there was reason to believe the offensive might achieve surprise and initial success. American intelligence had indeed failed to detect the German buildup. The Ardennes sector was held by 4 under-strength divisions spread across 88 miles of front, some recovering from earlier battles, others fresh from the United States and untested in combat. Allied commanders considered the Ardennes as unsuitable for major operations. too forested and hilly for armor, too difficult for supply. This was precisely the calculation the French had made in 1940, when German panzers proved them catastrophically wrong by driving through the Ardennes in 3 days. Now, 4 years later, history seemed positioned to repeat itself. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, December 15th saw senior officers attending a wedding party, celebrating a British-American union that seemed to symbolize the Allied coalition's strength. Intelligence assessments that week concluded that Germany no longer possessed the capability for major offensive operations. The Luftwaffe was broken, German industry was shattered by bombing, the Eastern Front was consuming Germany's last reserves. The greatest danger seemed to be that Germany would collapse entirely before spring, requiring rapid Allied advances to prevent chaos. The tension between these two realities, German desperation versus Allied confidence, created the conditions for Hitler's gamble. At 0530 on December 16, 1944, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. American positions disappeared under a storm of high explosive and screaming rocket artillery. 90 minutes later, 3 German armies attacked through the morning darkness and fog. The 6th Panzer Army in the north aimed at Liège and the Meuse crossings north of Huy. The 5th Panzer Army in the center, tasked with capturing Bastogne and driving northwest to Brussels and Antwerp. The 7th Army in the south, protecting the flank against counterattack from Patton's 3rd Army. Among the 5th Panzer Army's spearhead formations was 2nd Panzer Division, assigned the most direct route to the Meuse River crossings at Dinant. They were given 3 days to reach the river, then push west to Antwerp. Their fuel allocation would last perhaps 60 kilometers. Everything beyond that depended on capturing American supplies or receiving resupply through traffic-choked roads that would be under air attack the moment the weather cleared. The initial results were stunning. American positions collapsed in confusion. The German advance achieved complete tactical surprise. Radio intercepts captured frantic calls from American units reporting breakthrough and requesting instructions. Within 24 hours, German forces had penetrated 6 to 12 kilometers on a broad front, further in some sectors. At Hitler's headquarters, the reports generated guarded optimism. Perhaps the gamble would work. Perhaps the Americans were as brittle as intelligence had suggested. Perhaps captured fuel would indeed materialize. Perhaps the bad weather would hold long enough to reach the Meuse before Allied air power could intervene. But already, even in the first day, signs of trouble appeared. American engineers were blowing bridges that German plans assumed would be captured intact. Traffic jams developed on the narrow roads as thousands of vehicles tried to funnel through a few passable routes. Small American units, surrounded and cut off, kept fighting from crossroads and villages, blocking roads and forcing German columns to deploy and fight rather than simply advance. The infantry divisions that were supposed to follow the panzers and clear these pockets fell farther and farther behind, caught in the same traffic jams and subjected to increasing American artillery fire. By December 18th, 72 hours into the offensive, the situation looked very different from the map at Adlerhorst than it did from the tank commanders at the front. On Hitler's map, red arrows showed German penetrations 20 to 40 kilometers deep, threatening positions, objectives within reach. On the ground, those red arrows represented exhausted men, tanks running on fumes, supply columns trapped in traffic jams stretching back to the German border. The weather, which had favored the initial attack, now turned against logistics. Snow and ice made the few roads available even slower. Vehicles that broke down could not be recovered and abandoned, blocking routes for those behind. The fuel trucks that were supposed to keep the panzers moving sat motionless in 100-kilometer-long traffic jams, while the tanks they were meant to supply ran dry waiting for them. And everywhere, the advance slowed not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the arithmetic of modern mechanized warfare had rendered Hitler's plan impossible from the moment it was conceived. The gambler had pushed his last chip to the center of the table, and the cards were beginning to turn against him, though it would take another week of fighting before the final outcome became undeniable. August 19, 1944. 300 American B-24 Liberator bombers, flying from Italian bases, crossed the Danube River and turned north toward the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. This is the culminating strike in a months-long campaign against Nazi Germany's last major source of natural petroleum. The refineries below have been hit repeatedly, but German engineers have proven remarkably adept at repairing damage, restoring production within weeks. Today's raid is different. The bombers carry a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs, and they have fighter escort all the way to the target, ensuring they can bomb with precision rather than simply dumping ordnance through clouds and hoping. For 90 minutes, explosions ripple through the refinery complex, destroying not just the easily repaired distillation towers, but the deep infrastructure, pumping stations, pipelines, storage tanks, control facilities that cannot be quickly replaced. When the smoke clears, Ploiești's production capacity has been reduced by 75%. Within a week, Soviet forces will overrun Romania in their summer offensive, capturing what remains. Germany's access to natural oil, already critically limited, has just become catastrophic. 4 months later, on December 10, 1944, German supply officers gather at a fuel depot near Bitburg, 20 kilometers behind the front line, conducting final inventory before the Ardennes Offensive launches. They are working with precise mathematics that will determine the fate of 400,000 men. The operation requires 15 million liters of fuel to reach its objectives. Actual fuel delivered to forward depots: 4.5 million liters. The shortfall, 10.5 million liters, roughly 70% of requirements, is supposed to be made up from captured American stocks. Officers exchange glances as they review these figures. Some are veterans who fought in North Africa, where Rommel's offensives repeatedly outran their logistics, leaving German tanks immobilized while British forces regrouped. Others served in Russia, where summer advances dissolved when fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with Panzer spearheads across the vast distances. Now, they are being asked to believe that an even more ambitious offensive, in worse weather, over more difficult terrain, with less fuel to start, will succeed by capturing supply dumps from an enemy who has shown no inclination to abandon valuable material. The fuel crisis facing Germany in winter 1944 was the culmination of two strategic failures that had been building for years. First, Germany never secured reliable access to natural oil. The Reich consumed approximately 10 million tons of petroleum products annually in peacetime, but domestic production provided only 700,000 tons. The gap was filled by imports from Romania and the Soviet Union until 1941. Then, by Romanian fields alone after Operation Barbarossa began. This dependence on a single source became a critical vulnerability when Allied bombers gained the range and strength to target Ploiești. Second, Germany's solution to oil scarcity, synthetic fuel production through the Fischer-Tropsch process, converting coal into gasoline, required massive industrial plants that became obvious targets once Allied strategic bombing commenced in earnest. In May 1944, German synthetic fuel plants produced 316,000 tons, just barely enough to sustain military operations. Then the systematic bombing campaign began. By December 1944, German fuel production had collapsed to 17,000 tons per month, a 95% reduction in 7 months. This was not a gradual decline, but a catastrophic implosion of the entire petroleum supply system. The numbers translated into stark operational reality. The Luftwaffe, which had flown thousands of sorties per day over France in 1940, could barely manage a few hundred sorties per week by December 44. The fuel didn't exist to train replacement pilots properly, so inexperienced crews were shot down on their first missions by veteran Allied pilots. The Kriegsmarine submarines and surface ships sat in port, immobilized for lack of diesel and fuel oil. The Wehrmacht's truck fleet, already inadequate, was reduced to a fraction of its theoretical capacity because vehicles sat idle without gasoline. Even training exercises at home bases were curtailed to preserve fuel for combat operations. The entire German military machine was effectively running on reserve tanks, consuming accumulated stockpiles that could not be replaced, counting down to the moment when the tanks would be empty and the machine would simply stop. The Panther tank, Germany's most effective armored vehicle in the Ardennes Offensive, illustrated the problem in miniature. Each Panther carried 700 liters of fuel in internal tanks. Under ideal conditions, cruising on good roads without combat, this provided a range of perhaps 200 kilometers. Under combat conditions, the range dropped dramatically. Maneuvering consumed more fuel than straight-line movement. Cold weather reduced engine efficiency. Transmissions that were already prone to mechanical problems under the best circumstances became even less reliable in winter, causing higher fuel consumption. Worst of all, the Panther's powerful Maybach engine, designed for high performance, was profoundly thirsty. At cruising speed, it consumed approximately 1.4 liters per kilometer. During combat, with frequent acceleration, deceleration, and maneuvering, consumption spiked to 2 liters per kilometer or more. A Panther company conducting a rapid advance might find its tanks on reserve fuel after only 60 kilometers, desperately needing refuel before they could continue. 2nd Panzer Division, preparing for the offensive, received an allocation of 250 cubic meters of fuel, 250,000 liters for its entire vehicle fleet of approximately 1,200 vehicles, including tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and support vehicles. Division planners calculated this would allow 1.5 complete refuelings, meaning tanks would start with full internal tanks, plus 1 additional complete refill available from division fuel trucks. After that, they would need to either capture American fuel or wait for resupply from Army-level fuel convoys. The distance from 2nd Panzer's assembly area to the Meuse River at Dinant was approximately 90 kilometers as the crow flies, perhaps 120 kilometers by the actual roads available through the Ardennes forests. Then another 60 kilometers from Dinant to Brussels, and 80 more kilometers to Antwerp. Total distance to final objective, 260 kilometers minimum. Fuel available, enough for perhaps 140 kilometers under combat conditions. The arithmetic was not complicated. 2nd Panzer Division could not reach its objective without capturing American fuel. The question was whether they could reach American fuel before their own tanks ran dry. The American fuel situation provided devastating contrast. While Germany was producing 17,000 tons of fuel per month and scraping together million-liter reserves for the Ardennes Offensive, the United States was producing 600,000 tons per month and shipping it to Europe in tankers that German submarines could no longer threaten effectively. American supply depots in Belgium held millions of liters, more than enough, to sustain current operations with large reserves. The challenge for American logistics was not scarcity, but distribution, getting fuel from ports to forward units fast enough to support Eisenhower's planned January offensive into Germany. Consequently, large fuel dumps sat at intermediate points throughout Belgium, positioned for future operations, relatively lightly guarded because the front line was still miles to the east. German intelligence had identified 3 particularly large dumps that, if captured, would provide approximately 4 million liters of gasoline and diesel. This became the basis for the Ardennes Offensive logistics plan. Start with 4.5 million liters, capture 4 million more from the Americans within the first 3 days, and use that total of 8.5 million to continue the advance while waiting for German supply columns to catch up. The plan's fundamental flaw was assuming the Americans would cooperate. On December 18, 1944, Kampfgruppe Piper, the lead battle group of 1st S Panzer Division, captured an American fuel depot at Bullingen with 90,000 gallons, roughly 340,000 liters, intact. It was the kind of windfall the offensive logistics plan anticipated. Piper's tanks, which had been running low after 2 days of combat, were refilled. But that fuel lasted only 1 day of fighting, and Piper never found another major fuel dump. American engineers were destroying or evacuating fuel stocks faster than German forces could reach them. By December 21st, Piper's Kampfgruppe was itself running dry near L'Église, tanks immobilized, surrounded by American forces. Piper would eventually abandon all his vehicles and escape on foot with 800 men. The 90,000 gallons captured at Bullingen had not changed the strategic situation. They had merely prolonged the inevitable by 24 hours. 2nd Panzer Division, advancing along a different axis than Piper, never captured any significant American fuel stocks. Their advance consumed fuel relentlessly, while the German supply system failed to deliver replacements. The division's main supply route ran east through Bastogne, but by December 20th, American forces had reached Bastogne and were beginning to encircle it. German supply columns trying to reach 2nd Panzer now had to detour far to the north or south, adding 50 kilometers to their journey. In the narrow Ardennes roads, already jammed with combat vehicles, Supply trucks sat motionless for hours, the precious fuel in their tanks going nowhere, while the tanks they were supposed to supply ran dry. The ironies were bitter. Fuel trucks carrying gasoline were consuming that gasoline sitting in traffic jams. Disabled vehicles that could have been recovered and repaired were abandoned for lack of recovery vehicle fuel. Some German units tried desperate improvisations, using horses to haul fuel cans forward, but a horse can carry perhaps 200 liters, barely enough to refuel one tank, and the horses couldn't move any faster than the trucks on the same clogged roads. By December 23rd, when 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion was approaching the Aure River, having covered 80 kilometers in 7 days, the division's fuel situation had become critical. Approximately 40% of the division's tanks had been abandoned along the route, not destroyed by enemy fire, but simply out of fuel. The remaining tanks were operating on fumes, siphoning fuel from immobilized vehicles to keep a few operational. Division headquarters radioed increasingly desperate requests for fuel to Army Command. Army Command responded with promises that fuel convoys were on the way, but those convoys were trapped in traffic jams 50 kilometers behind the front, under increasing American artillery fire, moving at walking pace when they moved at all. The order that Major von Boom received on December 23rd reflected the command's desperate calculus: push forward regardless of fuel state, reach the Meuse, seize a bridgehead, and hold until supplies arrived. It was an order that assumed crossing the river would somehow solve the logistics crisis, that capturing a bridge would cause fuel to materialize. It was an order born of hope rather than calculation, and it condemned von Boom's Macht to reach the furthest point of the German advance and become trapped there, 5 kilometers short of their objective, waiting for fuel that would never come. May 15th, 1940, the village of Sedan in northeastern France. German 2nd Panzer Division crosses the Meuse River under fire, combat engineers throwing pontoon bridges across the water, while Stuka dive bombers suppress French artillery on the opposite bank. 19-year-old Lieutenant Hans-Georg Model, nephew of the future field marshal, remembers the crossing as orchestrated chaos. The scream of Stukas, the metallic rattle of machine gun fire, the roar of Panzer IIIs and IVs gunning their engines to climb the western bank through mud churned by shells. French resistance collapses after 6 hours of sustained assault. By nightfall, 2nd Panzer Division is across the Meuse and driving west. The breakthrough that will shatter France's defensive plans and change the course of World War II. 4 years and 7 months later, 2nd Panzer Division would be asked to perform the same miracle on the same river, and the men who survived both campaigns would understand the bitter difference between possibility and impossibility. The division that prepared for the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944 bore the same designation as the one that crossed the Meuse in May 1940, but it was a fundamentally different organization. The original division, formed in 1935 from Prussian military traditions and professional soldiers, had been rebuilt 3 times after catastrophic casualties on the Eastern Front. The division that fought at Stalingrad in winter 1942 and 43 suffered 92% casualties. The rebuilt division was shattered again during Operation Citadel at Kursk in summer 1943, losing 2/3 of its armor in a week of desperate tank battles. Rebuilt again, it was gutted in the fighting withdrawals across Ukraine and Byelorussia in 1944. Each rebuilding diluted the division's experience and cohesion. Veterans who knew armored warfare doctrine were replaced by infantry transfers who had never crewed a tank. Panzer aces with years of combat experience were replaced by 18-year-olds with 6 weeks of training. By December 1944, 2nd Panzer Division retained its elite designation and institutional pride, but it was no longer the finely tuned instrument that had crossed the Meuse in 1940. The division's commander, Oberst Meinrad von Lauchert, received his new command in October 1944, while the division was being reconstituted in Westphalia. Von Lauchert was 34 years old, young for command of an armored division, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had earned the Knight's Cross for a successful counterattack during the Soviet summer offensive. He arrived at division headquarters expecting to find the elite formation he had heard about in staff briefings. Instead, he found 12,000 men, approximately 70% of authorized strength, many of them recent replacements or transfers from other units. The vehicle park contained 88 tanks, less than half the division's authorized strength and one-fourth what the division had fielded in France in 1940. Yet, von Lauchert also recognized that this tank fleet, though smaller, represented a qualitative improvement over anything the division had possessed in the earlier war. The 88 tanks included 27 Panthers, Germany's most effective medium tank, and 3 Tiger IIs, the massive 70-ton behemoths mounting an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The remaining 58 Panzer IVs, though increasingly obsolescent, were still effective when properly employed. Von Lauchert spent 6 weeks preparing the division for offensive operations, knowing that elite reputation alone would not compensate for lack of training and experience. Tank crews drilled in formation maneuvers, gunnery, and the rapid advances that armored warfare required. Infantry battalions practiced the close coordination with armor that was essential for success but difficult to achieve with units that had never worked together. Supply officers calculated fuel and ammunition requirements with painful precision, understanding that the margin for error was zero. Von Lauchert emphasized speed above all else. In modern mobile warfare, speed was defense. A rapidly moving target was harder to hit than a stationary one. A fast advance disrupted enemy planning and prevented reinforcement. Speed could compensate for inferior numbers and resources, but only if every element of the division executed its role flawlessly. The final briefing before the offensive, delivered to battalion and company commanders in a requisitioned factory hall, emphasized this point repeatedly. They would advance fast, bypass resistance when possible, and drive toward the Meuse regardless of what happened on their flanks. Success depended on maintaining momentum. Stopping to fight would be defeat even if they won the local engagement. The division's sector assignment reflected its elite status and the High Command's confidence in von Lauchert's capabilities. 2nd Panzer Division would attack as part of 5th Panzer Army's 17th Panzer Corps, assigned the most direct route to the Meuse River crossings at Dinant. The initial breakthrough would be accomplished by Panzer Lehr Division attacking south of Bastogne, opening a corridor through American lines. 2nd Panzer would then exploit through that corridor, bypassing Bastogne to the north, and race west toward Dinant. The distance was 90 kilometers to be covered in 48 hours if the offensive timetable was to be maintained. Once across the Meuse, 2nd Panzer would turn northwest toward Brussels and Antwerp, joined by follow-on divisions that would exploit the breakthrough. On paper, the plan was elegant. In practice, it depended on a dozen assumptions that all needed to be correct simultaneously. American resistance would be weak, roads would be passable, fuel would be available, weather would ground Allied aircraft, bridges would be captured intact, traffic would flow smoothly. If any assumption proved wrong, the entire operation would slow or stall. The tank commanders who would lead the advance understood they were being asked to recreate 1940 with far inferior resources. In May 1940, 2nd Panzer Division had fielded 218 tanks and assault guns, supported by motorized infantry, artillery, and air support that dominated the battlefield. They had faced French forces that, though numerically superior, were dispersed along the entire front and committed to a defensive doctrine that made them slow to react. The breakthrough succeeded because German tactical doctrine, concentrate force at a single point, achieve breakthrough, exploit rapidly before the enemy can respond, proved superior to French assumptions about gradual defensive battles. In December 1944, 2nd Panzer had 88 tanks facing American forces that, though spread thin in the Ardennes, could call on massive reserves positioned throughout Belgium and France. The Americans possessed total air superiority if the weather cleared, artillery superiority in every engagement, and a logistics system that could move entire divisions hundreds of kilometers in days. What 2nd Panzer retained was tactical expertise, the ability to move fast and hit hard, and the desperate motivation of men who knew they were fighting not just for military objectives, but for the survival of their homeland. The men of 2nd Panzer Division represented a cross-section of Germany in the war's final year. Some were veterans of the Eastern Front, survivors of campaigns in Russia where entire divisions had been destroyed and reformed. These men knew what modern industrialized warfare looked like at its most terrible. They had faced Soviet tanks attacks where hundreds of T-34s came forward in waves, accepting 50% casualties to break through German lines. They had seen entire German armies encircled and annihilated because logistics collapsed and mobility died. They approached the Ardennes Offensive with a kind of fatalistic professionalism, knowing their skills might buy temporary advantage, but couldn't change the strategic trajectory. Others were younger, men, 18 and 19 years old, conscripted from the shrinking pool of German manpower, given abbreviated training, and assigned to frontline units that desperately needed replacements. These men knew war only through propaganda and the progressively grimmer news from all fronts. For them, the Ardennes Offensive represented a chance to prove themselves, to demonstrate that Germany could still strike back despite setbacks. The division's morale before the offensive reflected this mixture of experience and naivete. Veterans were skeptical about reaching Antwerp, but confident they could break through American lines and create chaos. Newer soldiers were more optimistic, believing the propaganda claims that Germany retained secret weapons and strategic reserves that would turn the war. Von Lauchert himself occupied a middle position. He believed 2nd Panzer could reach the Meuse River if conditions favored them, but he harbored private doubts about whether crossing the river would be possible even if they reached it. In conversations with his staff, he emphasized that their responsibility was to execute their orders to the best of their ability, not to question the strategic wisdom behind those orders. This was the German military tradition, obedience to lawful orders regardless of personal opinion. It was also a tradition that, by December 1944, had led the Wehrmacht into a war it could not win, following orders from a leadership increasingly detached from reality. The equipment 2nd Panzer took into the offensive represented the best Germany could still produce in limited quantities, but also the growing compromises imposed by material shortages. The 27 Panthers were formidable tanks, mounting a 75mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank armor at combat ranges, protected by thick sloped armor that could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons. But the Panther's Achilles heel was mechanical reliability. The transmission, overworked by the tank's 45-ton weight, failed frequently. Final drives wore out quickly under hard use. Fuel pumps failed, road wheels broke. A Panther company that started a battle with 15 operational tanks might finish with only 10. Not because of enemy action, but because of mechanical breakdown. The 3 Tiger IIs were even more impressive and even more problematic. Mounting an 88mm gun derived from the legendary Flak 41 anti-aircraft gun, a Tiger II could destroy any Allied tank at ranges beyond 3,000 meters, far beyond the range at which Allied guns could penetrate its armor. But at 70 tons, the Tiger II was so heavy that few bridges could support it. Its fuel consumption was catastrophic, and its complexity meant that any mechanical problem often required specialized workshop facilities to repair. The division's organization reflected the Wehrmacht's adaptation to diminishing resources. Instead of the 3 tank categories, battalions and 4 motorized infantry battalions of the 1940 division, the December 1944 division had 2 tank battalions and 3 infantry battalions, all under strength. The artillery regiment had been reduced from 4 battalions to 3. The anti-aircraft battalion, once equipped with the excellent 88mm dual-purpose guns, now fielded a mixture of weapons, including captured Soviet and French pieces, used because German production couldn't meet demand. Most critically, the division's supply echelon had been reduced, meaning fewer trucks to haul fuel and ammunition forward. Von Lauchert understood that this lighter supply echelon would become a strangling weakness during a long-range offensive, but he had no authority to demand more resources. Every German division in the West was short of everything: fuel, ammunition, vehicles, spare parts, trained personnel. 2nd Panzer Division received priority allocation of resources for the offensive, but priority meant they were less short than other units, not that they had everything they needed. On the night of December 15, 1944, the division moved into its attack positions east of the Aar River. Crews performed final maintenance on their vehicles, loading ammunition, checking fuel levels, running engines to ensure they would start in the morning cold. Von Lauchert issued final orders to his commanders: advance fast, bypass resistance when possible, reach the Meuse in 2 days, cross the river regardless of opposition. The officers acknowledged their orders, knowing they would lead men who believed in them into an offensive that had only a marginal chance of success. In 4.5 years of war, 2nd Panzer Division had achieved extraordinary victories and suffered catastrophic defeats. Now, it would attempt to recreate its greatest triumph under conditions that made success impossible. The men checking their tanks in the darkness had no way of knowing they were about to drive into history as the spear point of Germany's last offensive, reaching the furthest point of advance before being destroyed in a snow-covered Belgian village whose name most had never heard. Their confidence, earned through genuine skill and hard experience, would prove insufficient against the arithmetic of modern war. But on that final night before the offensive began, confidence was all they had, and they carried it forward into the dark Ardennes forests as they had been trained to do. December 10th, 1944. The village of Chenogne in the Luxembourg Ardennes is 8 kilometers from the German border. Lieutenant Paul Gundlach, commander of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, stands in the main street watching his men unload supplies from trucks. The regiment is spread thin across 25 kilometers of front line, roughly triple the normal defensive deployment. Gundlach's own company holds a sector that would normally require a full battalion. His men occupy a series of fortified positions in villages and farmhouses, with gaps of hundreds of meters between strong points, gaps covered only by patrols and hoping the Germans don't find the weak spots. The sector has been quiet for 6 weeks, earning the nickname Ghost Front from soldiers who rotate here to rest after intense combat in places like Hurtgen Forest or Metz. Gundlach knows his men appreciate the relative peace, but he also knows that quiet fronts don't stay quiet forever. German positions visible on the wooded ridges across the Our River show occasional activity. Lights at night, the sound of vehicles moving. Standard defensive behavior, or something more. The American 8th Corps, commanded by Major General Troy Middleton from headquarters in Bastogne, held responsibility for the entire Ardennes sector in December 1944. It was simultaneously the quietest and the most vulnerable section of the Allied line in Western Europe. The quiet came from strategic calculation. Senior Allied commanders considered the Ardennes unsuitable for major operations. The terrain was heavily forested, hilly, cut by numerous rivers and streams, with a road network inadequate for large-scale military movement. The same factors that made the Ardennes an unlikely avenue of advance made it ideal for defensive economy, holding the sector with minimal forces while concentrating strength elsewhere for offensive operations. The vulnerability came from taking this logic to an extreme. 8 corps defended an 88-mile front with 4 divisions, giving each division 22 miles on average. Standard U.S. Army doctrine called for 1 division per 5 to 7 miles of front in defensive terrain, meaning 8 corps needed at least 12 divisions for the sector it held. This was not ignorance or negligence. This was deliberate risk, accepting vulnerability in one sector to achieve strength elsewhere. The 4 divisions holding the Ardennes represented either inexperience or exhaustion, units placed in quiet sectors for specific reasons. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived from the United States in early December, fresh troops experiencing their first combat assignment. They occupied positions on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge that were actually east of the Our River, a bulge in the American line left over from the initial advance in September. The division had been in the line exactly 5 days when the German offensive began. The 28th Infantry Division, Gundlach's unit, was rebuilding after losing approximately 6,000 men in the Hurtgen Forest during November 1944. That battle, an attempt to capture the Roer River dams and break through the German West Wall, had been a meat grinder consuming entire regiments in dense forest fighting, where visibility was measured in meters and every advance required assaulting German bunkers in prepared defenses. The 28th Division that held the Ardennes in December was reconstituted with replacement troops, many of whom had never seen combat. The 4th Infantry Division and the 9th Armored Division completed 8 corps' order of battle, both under strength, both positioned in the Ardennes for rest and refitting after earlier operations. Behind this thin American line, 60 kilometers to the west near Chenogne, Belgium, the British 29th Armored Brigade occupied positions as Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Reserve. The brigade, part of British X-Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, had fought through Operation Market Garden in September, the ambitious but failed attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine in Holland. In December, the brigade was refitting, integrating replacement tanks and crews, and expecting Christmas passes for soldiers who had been in continuous combat since D-Day. The Sherman and Cromwell tanks sat in maintenance parks, or lager positions, crews performing routine maintenance, no expectation of imminent combat. The brigade's positioning reflected Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's careful defensive arrangements. Montgomery, commanding British 21st Army Group in the northern sector of the Allied line, had argued since September for a concentrated single thrust into Germany rather than Eisenhower's broad front strategy. When overruled, Montgomery positioned his reserves to protect the Meuse River crossings, the natural defensive barrier between the Ardennes and Brussels. If anything went wrong in the Ardennes, British reserves could move quickly to secure the river and prevent German forces from reaching the open terrain beyond. The intelligence failure that allowed the German buildup to proceed undetected was comprehensive and multi-layered. Allied photo reconnaissance flights over the Eifel region east of the Ardennes showed normal defensive activity. What reconnaissance could not see were the German forces concealed in forests, moving only at night, maintaining radio silence, camouflaging vehicles and equipment with extraordinary discipline. Allied signals intelligence, which had been reading German Enigma codes since 1942 through the Ultra program, detected nothing because German planners imposed complete radio silence on all offensive preparations. Orders were delivered by courier, not transmitted by radio. Units moved to assembly areas using landlines for communication, not wireless. The result was an intelligence blackout, just when Allied commanders most needed information. Tactical interrogation of German prisoners suggested declining morale and increasing supply difficulties, reinforcing the assessment that Germany was on its last legs. German defectors and deserters, questioned about their unit's status, confirmed that shortages were endemic. What none of them knew was that Germany had stripped its Western Front defensive positions to assemble a massive offensive force in the one sector where Allies expected nothing. The Allied intelligence estimate for December 15, 1944, the day before the offensive began, concluded that Germany no longer possessed capability or intent for major offensive operations. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to ineffectiveness by fuel shortages and aircrew losses. German armored strength was assessed at approximately 600 tanks in the west, dispersed along the entire front from Holland to Switzerland. German infantry divisions were rated at 50 to 60% of authorized strength, adequate for defense but insufficient for sustained offensive operations. The most likely German strategic response, according to intelligence, was to conduct a controlled fighting withdrawal to the Rhine River, establishing a final defensive line on the natural barrier while husbanding resources for the inevitable Allied crossing in spring. This assessment was not unreasonable given available evidence. It simply failed to account for Hitler's willingness to gamble everything on one desperate offensive, concealing preparations with such discipline that normal intelligence collection methods detected nothing until the attack began. General Middleton, commanding 8 corps from Bastogne, understood his sector's vulnerability even if higher command dismissed the risk. Middleton was 55 years old, a World War I veteran, a professional soldier who had commanded the 45th Infantry Division through Sicily and southern France before being assigned to Aeschi Corps. He knew the Ardennes from military history. This was where German armies had advanced in 1870, 1914, and most dramatically in May 1940 when they shattered French defenses. The terrain that made offensive operations difficult also made defensive operations problematic. His divisions were too dispersed to support each other quickly. His corps reserve consisted of exactly 1 combat engineer battalion. If Germans attacked with multiple divisions concentrated on a narrow front, they would achieve breakthrough before he could shift forces to contain it. Middleton requested additional divisions from 1st Army headquarters. Request denied. He asked for increased reconnaissance and patrolling opposite his sector. Approved, but the patrols found nothing conclusive. Middleton positioned his headquarters in Bastogne specifically because the town was the critical road junction through which any German advance into his sector would need to pass. If the Germans came, Bastogne would become the decisive terrain. He could not know that this calculation would prove prophetically correct. The soldiers in the line on December 15th had their own indicators that something unusual might be happening, but lacked context to interpret them correctly. Patrols reported hearing vehicle sounds from German positions, more than the normal baseline. Forward observers noted lights visible at night, deeper in German territory than usual, suggesting troop movements. German artillery had been unusually quiet for several days, possibly indicating ammunition stockpiling. A few German prisoners taken in early December, patrols spoke about offensive preparations, but these statements were dismissed as bravado or deception. The pattern that was obvious in retrospect, Germany massing forces for attack, was invisible in real time because each indicator could be explained innocently and because Allied command expectations shaped interpretation. Senior commanders expected German defensive withdrawal, so indicators of offensive preparations were filed away as ambiguous. The cognitive bias of expecting what you want to see, rather than preparing for what might happen, affected everyone from division headquarters to platoon leaders. American defensive positions in the Ardennes reflected the sector's low priority. Most units occupied villages and key road junctions, fortifying buildings with sandbags and mines, establishing fields of fire along likely approach routes. Between these strong points, the line was held by outposts and patrols, small groups of soldiers in foxholes watching no man's land, connected to their company headquarters by field telephone. This defense in depth was adequate against probing attacks or infiltration, but it was not designed to stop massed armor supported by artillery preparation. The 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment, holding 25 kilometers of front, had exactly 9 rifle companies in the line, each company responsible for sectors of 2 to 3 kilometers. Paul Gundlas's Company K at Hosingen covered approximately 2.5 kilometers. His 190 men occupied positions in the village and 2 hilltop outposts. If the Germans came in force, his orders were to delay as long as possible, inflicting casualties, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. No one expected he would need to execute those orders. The quiet front was expected to stay quiet. 60 kilometers west at British 29th Armored Brigade headquarters, Christmas preparations were underway. The brigade was scheduled to provide security for a 1st Army headquarters Christmas party on December 16th. Tank crews anticipated several days of stand-down, perhaps passes to Brussels for those who drew lucky numbers. Maintenance sections were caught up on repairs. Ammunition stocks were full. Fuel was abundant. The contrast with German logistics would prove decisive in the coming battle, though no one appreciated it yet. The brigade commander, Brigadier Roscoe Harvey, reviewed intelligence summaries as routine before signing off for the day. Nothing indicated any change in the strategic situation. The Germans were beaten, contained, awaiting the final Allied offensive that would cross the Rhine and end the war. Harvey authorized Christmas leave for a third of his men, planning to rotate the others through over the following week. By noon on December 16th, those authorizations would be canceled, and the entire brigade would be racing south toward Celles. But on the evening of December 15th, the war seemed to be progressing according to plan. The failure to anticipate the Ardennes Offensive represented the last time Germany would achieve strategic surprise against the Western Allies. After December 16, Allied intelligence would never again underestimate German capabilities or intentions. The offensive succeeded initially not because of German strength, but because of Allied weakness in a deliberately weakened sector. The 4 American divisions holding the Ardennes were adequate for the mission they had been assigned, maintaining a quiet front with minimal forces, but catastrophically insufficient for the mission they would face. Stopping 20 German divisions attacking on a narrow front with overwhelming local superiority. Within 48 hours of the offensive beginning, the situation would transform from complacency to crisis. 8 corps would be shattered, tens of thousands of American soldiers surrounded and captured or killed, the entire Allied strategic plan thrown into chaos. But on December 15th, 1944, the Ghost Front was still quiet, and the men holding it still believed they were in a safe sector. They would learn differently when 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire at 05:30 the next morning, December 16, 1944, 05:30 hours. The darkness along the Ardennes front erupts in fire. 2,000 German artillery pieces and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, the largest German barrage on the Western Front since 1940. The sound is overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that shakes the ground and breaks windows in villages 10 kilometers behind the lines. American positions disappear under cascading explosions of high explosive, white phosphorus, and smoke shells. Telephone lines connecting forward outposts to company headquarters are severed in the first minutes. Radio communications dissolve into static and panicked fragments. In the village of Hosingen, Lieutenant Paul Gundlach feels the concussion of shells landing in the street outside his command post, watches plaster dust drift down from the ceiling, and realizes with sudden clarity that the quiet front has just died. This is not harassing fire or a local raid. This is preparation for a major attack. 90 minutes later, the barrage lifts and German infantry emerge from the forests on the eastern bank of the Our River, assault boats carrying them across the water, combat engineers throwing temporary bridges behind them for the tanks waiting to follow. The 2nd Panzer Division's attack sector lay in the northern portion of the 5th Panzer Army's advance, aimed at the Sur, villages held by the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment. The initial assault was conducted by the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, whose infantry would breach American positions and open corridors through which 2nd Panzer's armor could exploit. This was standard German combined arms doctrine. Infantry creates the breakthrough, armor exploits it before the enemy can react. The plan assumed the breakthrough phase would take 6 to 8 hours, after which 2nd Panzer would race through, bypassing continuing resistance, driving west toward the Meuse. Reality deviated from the plan within the first hour. American defensive positions, though thinly spread, were located on good terrain with clear fields of fire. The German infantry attacking across open ground took heavy casualties from machine gun and rifle fire. Buildings in Hosingen and surrounding villages had been fortified and required systematic reduction. By mid-morning, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had penetrated American forward positions but had not achieved clean breakthrough. Fighting continued in villages that were supposed to have fallen in the first hours. Oberst von Lauchart, commanding 2nd Panzer Division from his headquarters 5 kilometers behind the front, monitored radio reports with growing frustration. The timetable was already slipping. His division was supposed to be advancing by noon. It was now 1300 hours, and the infantry was still fighting for objectives that should have been secured 8 hours ago. Von Lauchert made the decision that would characterize German tactics throughout the offensive. He ordered his reconnaissance battalion forward immediately, directed to bypass still fighting American positions and find routes westward. If the infantry couldn't open clean corridors, the armor would find its own way. The reconnaissance battalion, equipped with armored cars and half-tracks, pushed through gaps in the American line and began advancing along secondary roads, reporting their progress by radio. Behind them, tank battalions prepared to follow, engines running, commanders standing in turrets scanning for the order to move. December 17th, 2nd Panzer Division's Panthers finally break free of the congested breakthrough area and begin the advance westward. The sensation is electric after the frustration of the previous day. Tank commanders feel the surge of speed as their vehicles hit open road, the powerful Maybach engines accelerating the 45-ton tanks to 40 kilometers per hour. Infantry rides on the tank decks, saving fuel by not starting their half-tracks. The column stretches for kilometers, reconnaissance vehicles in the lead, then tank companies in march formation, then artillery and supply trucks trailing behind. The route takes them through the Klurf River Valley, where the 28th Division's 110th Regiment is fighting its last stands in villages along the river. Von Lauchert orders his forces to bypass these strong points when possible, engaging only when the route is blocked. At the town of Clairvaux, American defenders on high ground command the bridge. 2nd Panzer needs to cross. There is no bypass. The division must fight through. The battle for Clairvaux consumes 18 hours that 2nd Panzer Division cannot afford. American defenders, remnants of several companies consolidated under local command, occupy stone buildings that resist tank cannon fire. Each building must be reduced individually, Panthers firing at point-blank range to collapse walls, infantry moving in to clear the ruins. German casualties mount slowly but steadily. More critically, time evaporates. The offensive timetable required 2nd Panzer to be 40 kilometers beyond Clairvaux by December 17th evening. Instead, they are still fighting for the town. Fuel consumption is worse than calculated. Stop-and-start combat maneuvering burns gasoline faster than steady cruising. Ammunition expenditure is high. Each building requires dozens of main gun rounds and hundreds of machine gun rounds to suppress. And behind the fighting vehicles, the critical supply columns are trapped in traffic jams, stretching back to the German border, fuel trucks carrying the gasoline. 2nd Panzer desperately needs sit immobile on roads clogged with vehicles from multiple divisions, unable to move forward or back. December 19th. 2nd Panzer Division's advance resumes after securing Clairvaux at terrible cost. The division has lost 12 tanks destroyed and 800 men killed or wounded in 3 days of fighting. More significantly, they have lost time. 72 hours into the offensive, they are only 30 kilometers from their start line, roughly 1/3 of the distance to the Meuse River. The timetable that called for crossing the Meuse on December 20th is now impossible. Von Lauchert receives updated orders from Corps headquarters: bypass Bastogne to the north, continue west, reach the Meuse as quickly as possible, regardless of schedule. The relief in the order is that higher command has accepted reality. The original timetable is dead. The pressure remains to move fast, but the fantasy of perfect execution has been abandoned. 2nd Panzer's columns swing north of Bastogne, glimpsing the town in the distance. American forces are already reinforcing the position. Von Lauchert makes the correct tactical decision to avoid getting drawn into urban combat for a crossroads. His orders tell him to bypass. The advance from December 19th through December 22nd becomes a race against 3 invisible enemies: fuel, time, and isolation. Fuel because every kilometer consumes gasoline that is not being replaced. The supply columns are still trapped far behind, under increasing American artillery fire. Time because Allied forces are reacting, moving reserves toward the breakthrough, preparing defenses at the Meuse River crossings. Isolation because 2nd Panzer is advancing faster than the infantry divisions on its flanks, creating a salient that narrows as it pushes west. The division is like a spear point extending from the shaft, effective only if the shaft remains strong. In this case, the shaft is weakening. American forces at Bastogne have cut the main supply route. The secondary roads 2nd Panzer is using are under interdiction by American artillery. The Panthers rolling west are increasingly alone, their supporting infantry falling behind, their flanks exposed, their supply lines tenuous. December 22nd. 2nd Panzer Division reaches the River at Orthieuville, 70 kilometers from their start line, 20 kilometers from the Meuse. This is the furthest advance any German division will achieve in the entire offensive, though no one knows that yet. Combat engineers throw a bridge across the river under sporadic American artillery fire, working through the night to complete the crossing. Tank battalions cross at dawn on December 23rd, Panthers lurching across temporary bridges that sway under the weight. The reconnaissance battalion pushes ahead immediately, reaching the village of Foy Notre Dame by mid-morning. Radio reports back that they can see the Meuse Valley in the distance, approximately 8 kilometers away. The division's lead elements are tantalizingly close to their first objective. Von Lauchert reviews his situation: 40 operational tanks with fuel, another 40 stationary with empty tanks, 800 men of the reconnaissance battalion 5 kilometers ahead of the main body, and supply columns still 50 kilometers to the rear under American attack. The weather that has favored the German advance since December 16th, fog and clouds keeping Allied aircraft grounded, begins to change on December 23rd. Midday, breaks appear in the overcast. By afternoon, clear patches open across the Ardennes. American fighter bombers appear for the first time since the offensive began, P-47s and Typhoons hunting for targets. They find 2nd Panzer Division's supply columns on the roads east of the River. The attacks are devastating. Fuel trucks explode in fireballs. Ammunition transporters detonate in chains of secondary explosions. The few supply vehicles that survive scatter into the forests, trying to find cover. The fuel that 2nd Panzer needs to continue advancing, that is finally close enough to deliver, burns on the roads in black smoke pillars visible for kilometers. Von Lauchert receives the reports and understands the offensive has entered its final phase. They are too close to stop voluntarily. They are too exposed to continue safely. The only option is to push the final distance to the Meuse with whatever fuel remains and hope that crossing the river somehow changes the equation. December 23rd, 2200 hours. Major Ernst von Boom, commanding. 2nd Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion receives orders directly from division headquarters. Push to the Meuse immediately with all available forces. Seize a bridgehead, hold until the main body arrives. Von Boom acknowledges the order and gives his own commands to company leaders. They move out in darkness, vehicles running without lights, navigating by map and compass. The route takes them through quiet farmland, past Belgian villages where civilians hide in their homes, hearing the sound of German tanks and fearing what morning will bring. By 0300 hours on December 24th, Christmas Eve morning, von Boom's lead vehicles enter the village of Chelles. No resistance, no American troops, just empty streets and frightened civilians. Von Boom establishes his command post in the center of the village and sends patrols forward to scout toward Dinant. The Meuse River, the objective that has consumed 8 days and thousands of German lives, lies 5 kilometers ahead. Von Boom's 600 men have reached the furthest point of the German advance. They have no way of knowing that they have also driven into a trap from which most of them will never escape. December 24th, 1944, 0300 hours. Christmas Eve in Chelles. Major Ernst von Boom stands in the village square, breath steaming in the frozen air, studying a Belgian road map by red-filtered flashlight. His reconnaissance battalion has accomplished something extraordinary. They have driven 90 kilometers through enemy lines in 8 days, bypassed American strongpoints, navigated narrow forest roads in darkness, and reached a position 5 kilometers from the Meuse River. Behind him, 25 Panther tanks and 15 Panzer IVs sit with engines idling, crews dismounted and moving through houses to clear them of potential threats. Belgian civilians huddle in cellars, terrified by the German soldiers suddenly appearing in their village in the pre-dawn darkness. Von Boom's radio operator is attempting to raise division headquarters to report their position, but signals are weak and intermittent. What von Boom doesn't know, cannot know in the darkness before dawn, is that his success has transformed him from spearhead into sacrifice. The decision to push those final 5 kilometers would be debated by military historians for decades afterward. Some would argue von Boom should have halted at the Arthe River, consolidating his position, waiting for the main body to catch up before advancing further. Others would note that his orders were explicit: reach the Meuse, seize a bridgehead, and holding short of the objective would be disobedience. Von Boom himself, in post-war interviews from a prisoner of war camp, would say simply that he was following the orders given, executing the mission assigned, doing what German officers had been trained to do for generations. The concept of mission-type orders, Auftrags tactic in German military doctrine, gave subordinate commanders latitude to achieve objectives using their own judgment, but it did not give them permission to decide objectives were impossible and stop trying. Von Boom had been ordered to reach the Meuse. He had reached the village 5 kilometers short of it. Pushing those final 5 kilometers was simply continuing the mission. What von Boom could observe as dawn broke on Christmas Eve told a troubling story. His reconnaissance patrols reported Allied vehicle traffic moving on roads to the west and north. Not just occasional trucks, but sustained military movement. Convoys of vehicles heading south toward Dinant. Belgian civilians, when questioned, reported seeing British tanks in the area 2 days earlier, though they had since moved away. Von Boom's own fuel situation was critical. His vehicles had approximately 800 liters of fuel remaining total, distributed unevenly across 40 tanks. Some tanks had enough fuel to reach Dinant and perhaps fight for a few hours. Others had barely enough to move a few kilometers. The battalion's supply trucks, which should have been carrying fuel forward, were somewhere back near the Arthe River, unable to move through the congested roads. Von Boom did the calculation that any armor commander would do: fuel enough for a one-way trip, not enough for round-trip or extended operations. The question was whether to make that one-way trip or consolidate and wait. The radio message that arrived at 0800 hours on December 24th made the decision for him. Division headquarters, finally reached through relay stations, transmitted clear orders. All units pushed to Meuse River, regardless of fuel state. Seize bridgehead at Dinant, hold until reinforcements arrive. Relief column departing from main body now, estimated arrival time 1600 hours. The message was signed by von Lauschert himself, indicating command emphasis. Von Boom acknowledged the order and assembled his officers. He showed them the map with routes to Dinant marked. He explained the fuel situation honestly. Some vehicles would make it, others would not. He explained the tactical situation. They were operating alone, deep in enemy territory, with uncertain flanks and tenuous supply. Then he gave the order that would seal their fate. Prepare to advance on Dinant in 1 hour. Priority vehicles get priority fuel. Immobilize vehicles without sufficient fuel. and redistribute their gasoline to operational tanks. The process of fuel redistribution consumed 90 minutes. Mechanics moved between tanks with hand pumps and jerry cans, siphoning fuel from immobilized vehicles into those selected to continue. The choices were brutal. Newer tanks with less mechanical wear got priority over older vehicles more likely to break down. Panther tanks with superior armor and guns got priority over Panzer IVs. Command vehicles retained fuel so officers could lead. The result was 15 Panthers and 5 Panzer IVs with enough fuel to reach Dinant, and 25 vehicles left behind in Chelles, immobilized but still capable of fighting if positioned defensively. Von Boom made a second critical decision: establish a defensive position in Chelles with the immobilized tanks and half his infantry. The mobile force would push to Dinant with the other half of the infantry. If they seized a bridgehead, the immobilized force would hold Celles as a waypoint for the relief column. If they failed to reach Dinant, they could fall back to Celles and establish defense there. By 1000 hours, the weather was clearing in a way that would prove catastrophic for German forces across the entire Ardennes battlefield. The fog and low clouds that had grounded Allied aircraft for 8 days were breaking up, revealing blue sky for the first time since the offensive began. Von Boom heard the aircraft before he saw them. A distant rumble growing louder, becoming the unmistakable sound of piston engines in formation. American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared from the west, flying low over the countryside, hunting for targets. Von Boom ordered his vehicles under cover immediately, tanks pulling into barns and under trees, camouflage nets hastily thrown over exposed vehicles. The Thunderbolts passed over Celles without attacking, apparently not spotting the concealed German force. But they did find targets to the east. 2nd Panzer Division's supply columns trying to move forward. Von Boom's men heard the explosions in the distance, saw smoke rising beyond the ridgeline. The aircraft were back, and with them came the end of German freedom of movement. Von Boom's planned advance on Dinant never occurred. At 1100 hours, scouts reported British tanks moving south from Ciney, approximately 20 kilometers north of Celles. At 1200 hours, Belgian civilians reported American vehicles moving east from Dinant. At 1300 hours, German positions at Foy Notre Dame, 5 kilometers north of Celles, came under artillery fire. The Allied response was developing faster than von Boom had anticipated. The intelligence picture was fragmentary, but clear enough. Enemy forces were converging on his position from multiple directions. The relief column that division headquarters promised at 1600 hours would have to fight through increasingly organized opposition to reach Celles. The attempt to advance on Dinant would drive his mobile force into the teeth of British defenses that were already establishing positions. Von Boom made the hardest decision of his military career. He radioed division headquarters requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions east of the Orthe River while routes remained open. The response came 30 minutes later. Negative. Hold Celles. Defend in place. Relief column will break through. The order to hold Celles transformed von Boom's reconnaissance battalion from Mobile's force into static defense. Through the afternoon of December 24th, his men worked feverishly to prepare defensive positions. Panthers were positioned hull down behind stone walls and buildings where their guns could cover approaches from north and west. Infantry dug foxholes in frozen ground, cursing the cold and the pickaxes that bounced off the hard earth. Machine guns were in place to create interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the roads entering the village. The civilians of Celles, approximately 300 people including children and elderly, were ordered into their cellars and told to stay there regardless of what happened above. Von Boom established his command post in the village church, its stone construction providing some protection against artillery, its tower offering observation over the surrounding countryside. From that tower, late on Christmas Eve afternoon, his observer could see clearly in all directions. German forces to the east, separated by several kilometers. British forces visible to the north. The Valley of the Meuse to the west, their objectives so close and now impossible to reach. As darkness fell on Christmas Eve, von Boom gathered his officers in the church basement for final briefing. He was honest about their situation because lies served no purpose. They were surrounded on 3 sides with only a narrow corridor east remaining open. That corridor was under artillery fire and might be closed at any time. Fuel was exhausted. The tanks could fight from their positions but could not maneuver. Ammunition was adequate for perhaps 12 hours of intense combat. The relief column had not arrived, and radio contact indicated it was engaged with American forces 20 kilometers to the east. Allied forces were clearly preparing an attack, probably to begin on Christmas morning. The battalion's mission was to hold Chelles for as long as possible, preventing Allied forces from using the village and the roads through it to attack 2nd Panzer Division's main body. If the relief column broke through, they would be extracted. If not, they would fight until their ammunition was exhausted, then attempt to break out on foot. Von Boehm's officers received these orders without comment. They were professional soldiers in an impossible situation, trained to do their duty regardless of outcome. The irony of their position was not lost on the men digging foxholes in the December cold. They had accomplished their mission with extraordinary skill and determination, driving through American lines, outmaneuvering enemy forces, reaching within 5 kilometers of their objective. In any previous war, such an advance would have been considered a brilliant success. But modern warfare measured success not by distance covered, but by objectives achieved and forces sustained. They had covered the distance but not achieved the objective. They had demonstrated tactical excellence but found themselves in strategic catastrophe. The 5 kilometers separating them from the Meuse River might as well have been 500. They were close enough to see the objective on maps, too far from it to matter militarily. And now, as British and American forces closed in from 3 directions, those 5 kilometers would become the measure of Germany's final defeat in the West. The distance was small enough to be heartbreaking, large enough to be decisive. On Christmas morning, 1944, the men of Kampfgruppe von Boehm woke in their foxholes around Chelles to a cold, clear dawn. Some had slept a few hours, despite the cold and the knowledge of what was coming. Others had stayed awake through the night, watching the darkness, listening for sounds of approaching enemies. The veterans among them, men who had fought in Russia and Poland and France, recognized this situation from experience. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by logistics. The outcome was not in doubt. The only question was how long they could hold, and how many of them would survive. That was what remained of Hitler's grand offensive, at its furthest point of advance. 600 German soldiers in a Belgian village, waiting for an attack they could not repel, hoping for relief that would not come, measuring their remaining lives in hours rather than days. The high-water mark of Nazi Germany's last great gamble in the West was being reached not at the Meuse River, not in Brussels, not in Antwerp, but in a village called Chelles, whose name none of them had heard before they drove into it on Christmas Eve. December 24th, 1944. 1,000 hours. Somewhere over the Ardennes, a British Cromwell tank commander named Lieutenant James Rothwell scans the countryside through binoculars, standing in the turret of his reconnaissance tank. His squadron from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment has been ordered to scout south from Ciney, confirming reports of German forces in the area. The weather has finally cleared after 8 days of fog, giving the first unrestricted visibility since the German offensive began. Rothwell spots something unusual in a village ahead. Vehicles under camouflage nets, movement patterns suggesting military presence, the angular silhouettes of tanks partially concealed. He studies the vehicles carefully through his binoculars. The shape of the turrets, the configuration of the hulls, the distinctive profile of German Panthers. Rothwell's radio crackles to life. Contact, contact. Enemy armor, approximately 20 tanks. Village of Chelles. Coordinates follow. The report goes up the chain of command, squadron to regiment, regiment to brigade, brigade to corps. Within 90 minutes, the British 29th Armored Brigade will receive orders to move immediately. The German spearhead has been located. The same moment, from the German perspective, represents the closing of a trap they cannot see. Major von Boehm, in his command post in Chelles Church, receives reports from his observation post that British reconnaissance vehicles have been spotted on the ridgeline to the north. They withdrew quickly, but their presence means discovery. Von Boehm knows what will follow. First reconnaissance, then artillery registration, then the main attack. He orders his defenders to complete preparation of defensive positions immediately. Camouflage must be improved. Fire lanes must be cleared. Ammunition must be distributed. The civilians must stay in their cellars no matter what happens above. His radio operator continues trying to reach division headquarters, trying to get information on the relief column that was supposed to arrive hours ago. The responses are vague and troubling. Relief column engaged with enemy forces, continuing to advance, maintain position. Von Boom translates this in his mind. The relief column is not coming, at least not in time to matter. His battalion is alone. At British 29th Armored Brigade headquarters near Chenogne, Brigadier Roscoe Harvey receives his orders at 1200 hours on Christmas Eve. German armor has reached Celles, 5 kilometers from Dinant. American forces are reported moving toward the same area from the east. Elwes Corps directs 29th Armored Brigade to deploy immediately to contain the German penetration and prevent any crossing of the Meuse. Harvey's officers scramble to translate strategic orders into tactical movement. The brigade has 120 tanks, a mix of Sherman M4s, Sherman Fireflies with 17-pounder guns, and Cromwell cruiser tanks. 3,000 men, fully supplied with fuel and ammunition, rested and ready. The challenge is movement, 60 kilometers from current positions to Celles, over roads that may be congested with retreating Belgian civilians and American forces repositioning. Harvey issues movement orders. 3rd Royal Tank Regiment leads, followed by supporting infantry and artillery. Objective is to establish blocking positions north and west of Celles, preventing German advance to Meuse. Rules of engagement. This is not a reconnaissance in force. This is a deliberate defensive deployment. Wait for Americans to arrive before attacking the German position. Combined arms coordination with our allies is essential. The movement of British 29th Armored Brigade on Christmas Eve afternoon demonstrated logistics-winning wars. 120 tanks, 60 kilometers, 18 hours, arriving in position ready to fight. This was possible because British supply lines functioned, because fuel was abundant, because maintenance had kept vehicle readiness high, because communications worked, and orders were transmitted efficiently. The contrast with 2nd Panzer Division's experience was absolute. Where German supply columns sat trapped in traffic under air attack, British columns moved on roads that Allied air forces protected. Where German tanks were siphoning fuel from immobilized vehicles, British tanks topped off from abundant supplies. Where German forces were scattered and disorganized by 8 days of combat, British forces were concentrated and fresh. The material superiority that had been building throughout 1944 was now expressing itself at the tactical level. Germany's excellent tanks and skilled crews were about to face Allied forces that had adequate equipment and overwhelming resources. By 1800 hours on Christmas Eve, British reconnaissance elements were in position on the ridgelines north and west of Celles, observing the German positions, calling artillery fire missions on approaches the Germans might use to withdraw. The German defenders in Celles could see the British tanks silhouetted on the high ground, count them, understand they were outnumbered at least 3-1. Von Boom's request for permission to attempt withdrawal while routes remained open was denied again. Corps headquarters insisted the relief column would break through, insisted Celles must be held to keep the corridor open. The officers reading those radio transmissions in the church basement understood they were being sacrificed, not through malice, but through the desperate logic of commanders who had no good options and chose to sacrifice 600 men rather than admit the entire offensive had failed. The men in Celles were being ordered to die slowly rather than allow Germany to acknowledge quickly that the gamble had not worked. The American response was developing more slowly but with greater weight. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, received alert orders on December 23rd at their positions near Havelange, 60 kilometers northeast of Celles. The division had been 1st Army Reserve, pulled from the line in November for refitting after heavy combat in Germany during the autumn. Now they were being committed to stop the German penetration that had broken through 8 corps. The division commander, Major General Ernest Harmon, was 56 years old, a cavalryman in the old army who had transitioned to armor between the wars. Aggressive, profane, demanding, Harmon drove his division hard. His orders were clear. Move to Celles area, coordinate with British forces, destroy German spearhead. The division's 14,000 men and 186 Sherman tanks began movement on December 24th, but the roads were difficult. Snow, ice, congestion from retreating American forces, and advancing reinforcements using the same routes. Combat Command A, leading the division advance, would not reach positions north of Celles until December 26th morning. The Germans in Celles had perhaps 36 hours before American armor arrived in strength. December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day. The men in Selles woke to continued isolation and increasing signs of Allied preparation for attack. Artillery fire was increasing around the perimeter, not intensive bombardment, but registration fire, Allied gunners finding their ranges, marking targets, preparing for the main attack. British tanks visible on the ridgelines were now reinforced by infantry and anti-tank guns, establishing complete encirclement from north and west. American forces were reported moving into positions to the east, closing the final corridor through which German relief might arrive. Von Boehm's fuel situation had become critical in an unexpected way. They had no fuel to run vehicles for warmth. The men were enduring December cold in foxholes and buildings without heat, rationing body warmth as carefully as they rationed ammunition. Medical supplies were adequate, but medical evacuation was impossible. Wounded men would have to remain in the village, treated by battalion medical personnel with limited supplies. The Christmas meal was cold rations eaten in fighting positions, celebrating the holiday by preparing for combat. The psychological weight of December 25th pressed on both sides differently. For the German defenders, Christmas Day spent in encirclement, knowing attack was coming, represented the dissolution of hope. Even the most optimistic soldiers could not imagine the relief column fighting through the forces now surrounding Chelles. Even the most dedicated Nazis could not deny that the offensive had failed. They would fight because that was their duty and their training, but they would fight without illusions. For the Allied forces preparing to attack, Christmas Day represented frustration that military necessity required combat on a day associated with peace. British and American soldiers understood their advantage, knew the Germans in Chelles were trapped and outnumbered, but they also knew those Germans were veterans of an elite division who would fight skillfully and desperately. The coming battle would not be easy, despite the numerical advantage. Men would die attacking a position that was already strategically irrelevant, fighting for tactical objectives in a battle whose outcome was already determined. The command discussions on Christmas Day revealed the fundamental difference between German and Allied approaches to the Selles situation. German Corps headquarters continued insisting that 2nd Panzer Division's main body would relieve the surrounded force, that Chelles must be held to maintain the corridor, that withdrawal would compromise the entire offensive's northern wing. This was fantasy disguised as operational planning. The main body was itself under attack, fuel exhausted, unable to advance or retreat effectively. No relief was possible, but admitting this meant admitting the offensive had failed, and German command was not yet ready to acknowledge reality. Allied command, by contrast, was coldly pragmatic. The German force in Chelles represented an opportunity to destroy an entire battalion of Germany's best remaining armor at favorable odds. The key tactical objective was to annihilate the German force while taking minimal casualties. The strategic objective was to demonstrate to German command that further offensive operations were impossible, that the Ardennes gamble had failed comprehensively. By late afternoon on Christmas Day, the dispositions around Selles were complete. British 29th Armored Brigade held positions north and west, approximately 90 tanks with supporting infantry and artillery. American 2nd Armored Division's Combat Command A was moving into positions northeast of Selles, approximately 70 tanks with supporting elements. American artillery battalions were registered on the German positions and the approaches to them. Allied fighter bombers were on call, ready to attack once weather permitted flight operations. The German defenders in Selles numbered approximately 600 men, 40 tanks and assault guns, with ammunition for perhaps 12 to 18 hours of combat and no possibility of resupply. The mathematics were overwhelming. What remained was the execution, the actual fighting that would determine not whether the Germans would be destroyed, but how quickly and at what cost to Allied forces. That execution would begin the next morning, December 26th, when Allied artillery would open fire at dawn, and the Battle of Selles would enter its final, bloody phase. December 24th, 1944, 1200 hours. The officers' mess at British 29th Armored Brigade headquarters near Ciney transforms from Christmas Eve celebration to operational planning in minutes. Brigadier Roscoe Harvey stands before a map of the Selles area, pointing with a swagger stick at the village where German forces have been located. His regiment commanders lean in, studying the terrain, the roads, the positions they will occupy. Harvey is 51 years old, a veteran of North Africa where his brigade fought at El Alamein, a professional soldier who believes in careful preparation and overwhelming force. His briefing is methodical. German strength estimated at battalion level, perhaps 40 tanks, unknown number of infantry. British advantages, numerical superiority, better positions, complete supply, air support when weather permits. Mission: establish blocking positions north and west of Selles, prevent German advance to Meuse, coordinate with arriving American forces for combined assault. Timeline: movement begins 1400 hours, occupy positions by nightfall, prepare for attack on December 26th. Questions from the assembled officers focus on practical details: fuel consumption for 60-kilometer movement, ammunition load, coordination with American 2nd Armored Division that will be operating in the same area. The movement south from Ciney demonstrated British attention to the logistics that made modern warfare possible. Each tank company conducted pre-movement maintenance, topping off fuel tanks, checking track, tension, verifying that radios functioned and weapons were loaded. Supply trucks followed the tank columns carrying additional fuel, ammunition, rations. Recovery vehicles positioned themselves to assist any tank that broke down during the move. Military police were positioned at key intersections to control traffic flow, preventing the congestion that had plagued German movements throughout the offensive. This was an army that had learned through 5 years of war how to move large formations quickly and arrive ready to fight. The contrast with 2nd Panzer Division's movement to Chelles, strung out over 90 kilometers, supply columns separated from combat units, fuel exhausted, could not have been more stark. British forces covered 60 kilometers in 18 hours and arrived concentrated, supplied, and prepared. German forces covered 90 kilometers in 8 days and arrived dispersed, exhausted, and out of fuel. Lieutenant James Rothwell, whose reconnaissance had discovered the German position, led his Cromwell tank squadron south on Christmas Eve afternoon, serving as advance guard for the main body following behind. The Cromwell was a British cruiser tank, lighter and faster than the American Sherman, but with similar armament, a 75mm gun adequate for most targets. Rothwell's mission was to scout routes, identify any German forces attempting to withdraw from Selles, and mark positions where the brigade would deploy. The countryside through which he moved was rolling farmland, fields divided by stone walls, scattered woods providing concealment, good tank country for defense, problematic for offense. The Germans in Selles occupied low ground in a valley, but they were dug in among buildings that would provide cover. The attackers would have to advance across open ground under German observation and fire. Rothwell identified several ridgelines north and west of Selles that would provide hull-down positions for British tanks, allowing them to fire on the village while exposing only their turrets. These positions would be key to the coming battle. By 1800 hours on Christmas Eve, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment had occupied positions on the high ground overlooking Selles. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, using binoculars to study the German positions in the gathering darkness. They could see camouflage nets, the angular shapes of German tanks among the village buildings, movement that indicated defensive preparation. The Germans knew they were being watched. Fire was exchanged, long-range shots, more harassment than serious combat, each side announcing its presence to the other. British artillery, having moved into position, fired ranging shots, walking rounds closer to German positions, establishing the fire lanes that would be used when the attack began. The Germans responded with their own artillery, few pieces but accurately fired, forcing British tankers to keep their heads down. This preliminary sparring established the pattern. The British had overwhelming firepower, but would have to advance under fire. The Germans were outnumbered, but occupied prepared positions. The battle would be decided by whether German skill could offset British resources. Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. British tankers on the ridgelines around Selles spent the day maintaining weapons, improving positions, and observing German activity in the village. Christmas dinner was hot tea and biscuits, eaten in fighting positions because withdrawal to rear areas for proper celebration would compromise the encirclement. Chaplains moved among the positions holding brief services, acknowledging the holiday while recognizing that combat would resume the next day. The British soldiers' attitude toward the Germans in Chelles was professional rather than personal. These were enemy forces that needed to be destroyed, not because of hatred, but because that was the military task. Many British soldiers were veterans of North Africa and Italy, men who had fought Germans for years and developed a kind of grudging respect for their military competence, even while committed to defeating them. The attitude was summarized by one tank commander's comment recorded in his diary. "Poor bastards down there are trapped, and they know it, but they'll fight hard because that's what they do. We'll have to kill most of them to take that village." The coordination between British and American forces demonstrated both the strengths and challenges of coalition warfare. Brigadier Harvey and Colonel Hugh O'Farrell, commanding Combat Command A of 2nd Armored Division, met on Christmas afternoon to coordinate the coming attack. The two officers had never worked together before. Their forces used different radio frequencies and tactical procedures, and their national doctrines emphasized different approaches to armored warfare. The British favored carefully prepared set-piece attacks with overwhelming fire support. The Americans favored aggressive maneuver and exploiting opportunities as they developed. The compromise they reached reflected pragmatic necessity. British forces would maintain the encirclement from north and west, while American forces attacked from the north and east. British artillery would provide initial bombardment. American artillery would shift to blocking fires to prevent German withdrawal. British tanks would provide support by fire from their hull-down positions. American tanks would maneuver to assault the village. This division of roles played to each force's strengths and avoided the confusion of intermixed units on the same battlefield. The British 29th Armored Brigade that surrounded Celles on Christmas Day, 1944, represented the culmination of British armor development through 5 years of war. The brigade had fought in North Africa, learning hard lessons about desert warfare against Rommel's Afrika Korps. It had fought in Italy, developing skills in close terrain where infantry armor coordination was essential. It had fought in Normandy and through Belgium, adapting to northern European conditions. The officers and men were volunteers, professionals who had chosen armored warfare as their specialty. The tanks they crewed were not the best in the world. British tank design had struggled throughout the war, producing vehicles that were either undergunned or unreliable or both. The Sherman tanks the brigade now used were actually American-built, supplied through Lend-Lease, modified by British workshops to mount the 17-pounder gun in the Firefly variant. But if the tanks were merely adequate, the crews were excellent. They knew their weapons, knew their tactics, and knew their enemy. The German forces in Chelles were about to face soldiers who had been fighting Germany for longer than the war had been going on for the United States, and who had learned through bitter experience how to win. The psychology of the British soldiers on Christmas Day was complex. They were far from home, spending Christmas in combat positions in Belgium, preparing to attack on the day after. They missed their families, resented the war that kept them from homes and normal life, and felt the grinding exhaustion of 5 years of combat. But they were also close to the end. Germany was clearly losing. The Ardennes Offensive, despite its initial success, was already collapsing. The war would be over in months, perhaps weeks if Germany collapsed quickly. Survival until the end was possible for men who had survived this long. This created a cautious mentality, willingness to fight and take necessary risks, but unwillingness to take unnecessary risks with the end so close. The coming attack on Celles would be methodical and careful, using firepower to minimize exposure, accepting slower progress to reduce casualties. No one wanted to be the last man killed in a war that was effectively over. The night of December 25th to December 26th was bitter cold around Celles. British tankers rotated watch, one man awake in each tank, while others tried to sleep in the limited warmth of the vehicle interior. Engines were started periodically through the night to prevent them freezing, but fuel conservation limited how often this could be done. Outside the tanks, infantry in slit trenches endured the cold with whatever shelter they could improvise. Ground sheets rigged as windbreaks, shared blankets, bodies pressed together for warmth. The Germans in Celles, visible when flares lit the night sky, were enduring the same cold with less shelter and no hope of relief. Both sides waited for dawn and the battle they knew was coming. British officers made final checks of their preparations, ammunition distributed, fire plans coordinated with artillery, radio frequencies confirmed, medical evacuation routes established. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now it was simply a matter of waiting for morning light and executing the plan. At 0700 hours on December 26th, 1944, one day after Christmas, British artillery opened fire on Celles. 180 guns, a full division's worth of artillery support, firing a 20-minute preparation bombardment on the 4-square-kilometer pocket holding the German forces. High explosive shells crashed into buildings, collapsing roofs, throwing shrapnel through the streets. Smoke shells mixed with the high explosive, blinding German observation posts, preventing them from directing return fire. The bombardment was the announcement that the Battle of Chenogne had begun in earnest. The British Household Cavalry, as the Royal Tank Regiment considered itself, descended from mounted cavalry traditions, was riding to battle. The German defenders in Chelles, having survived 8 days of combat and 2 days of encirclement, now faced the final test. How long could they hold against forces that outnumbered them 3-1, that controlled the high ground, that possessed unlimited ammunition, and that were determined to destroy them completely before nightfall? The answer to that question would be written in the next 32 hours, in the burned-out tanks and shattered buildings and frozen bodies that would litter the fields around a Belgian village that was about to become the graveyard of Hitler's last offensive. December 23, 1944, 1800 hours. Headquarters of the 2nd Armored Division, United States Army, at Havelange, Belgium. Major General Ernest Harmon reads the warning order that has just arrived from 1st Army Headquarters. Prepare for immediate movement to counter German breakthrough in Ardennes. Harmon is 56 years old, a hard-driving commander nicknamed Old Gravel Voice for his rough profanity and aggressive leadership style. His division, Hell on Wheels, has been in reserve since November, refitting after months of combat pushing into Germany during the autumn. Now they're being thrown back into action against the German offensive that has shattered Schiet Corps and threatens to reach the Meuse River. Harmon calls his staff together and issues preliminary orders. All units to full alert, conduct pre-combat maintenance, prepare for movement on 6 hours' notice. The warning order doesn't specify exactly where 2nd Armored will deploy, but Harmon knows they'll be sent to the most dangerous sector, wherever the German penetration is deepest. That's what reserves are for. The 2nd Armored Division that prepared to move on December 23rd was one of the most powerful armored formations in the European theater. 14,000 men, organized into 3 combat commands that could operate independently or as a concentrated force. 186 M4 Sherman medium tanks, 77 M5 Stuart light tanks for reconnaissance, self-propelled artillery, tank destroyers, armored infantry, combat engineers. The division had fought across France after the Normandy breakout, spearheaded the advance into Belgium, fought brutal urban combat in German border towns during October and November. They had lost men and equipment in that fighting. Approximately 20% casualties since D-Day, replaced by fresh troops and rebuilt tanks. The division that Harmon commanded in December 1944 was experienced but tired, combat-tested but not invincible, powerful but aware of its limitations. The Sherman tanks that equipped the division were outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, but American doctrine emphasized combined arms and maneuver rather than tank versus tank dueling. Artillery, air power, infantry, and numerical superiority were supposed to overcome technical inferiority. December 24, 1944, 0600 hours. Harmon receives confirmation orders. 2nd Armored Division will move to Ciney area, coordinate with British Sixth Corps, block German advance toward Meuse River. Intelligence reports indicate German spearhead has reached Celles, 5 kilometers from Dinant. Mission is to destroy that spearhead and prevent any further German advance. Harmon briefs his combat command leaders. Combat Command A under Brigadier General John Collier will attack from the north. Combat Command B under Brigadier General Isaac White will attack from the east. Combat Command Reserve will follow, prepared to exploit or reinforce. The division will move in stages, with units departing at intervals to avoid road congestion. Priority is speed. Get to Celles before the Germans can either break through to the Meuse or withdraw to better positions. The officers acknowledge their orders and return to their units to begin movement. Within 2 hours, 2nd Armored Division begins rolling toward battle. The movement of an armored division was a massive logistical undertaking requiring precise coordination. 14,000 men and approximately 3,500 vehicles spread across 60 kilometers of road when moving in march formation. The division's movement plan allocated different routes to different combat commands to avoid congestion, staggered departure times, and designated refueling points along the way. But no plan survives contact with reality. The roads 2nd Armored needed to use were already filled with other American units repositioning, with Belgian civilian refugees fleeing the battle zone, with supply trucks moving in both directions. Traffic control broke down almost immediately. Units took wrong turns at unmarked intersections. Tanks that broke down blocked the road behind them until recovery vehicles could tow them aside. The 60-kilometer movement from Havelange to Celles, which should have taken 8 to 10 hours, stretched to 18 hours for the lead elements and more than 24 hours for the trail units. Sergeant Michael Caruso, tank commander in B Company, 66th Armored Regiment, experienced the movement as organized chaos interrupted by periods of absolute stillness. His Sherman tank moved in column with 40 other tanks, maintaining 50-meter spacing, following the vehicle ahead through the darkness of Christmas Eve night. Then the column would stop, sitting motionless for 30 minutes or an hour, engines idling to prevent freezing, no information about why they'd stopped or when they'd move again. Then sudden movement, accelerating to close up gaps that had opened, racing to catch the vehicles ahead. At one point, Caruso's column sat stopped for 3 hours, while combat engineers repaired a bridge that had been damaged by retreating American forces. At another point, they detoured 20 kilometers to avoid a traffic jam, where 2 columns had tried to use the same intersection simultaneously and blocked each other. The frustration was intense. Every minute delayed was a minute the Germans and Celles might use to escape or reinforce. But there was no alternative except to keep moving when movement was possible and wait when it wasn't. The mechanical challenges of moving armor in winter added another layer of difficulty. Sherman tanks were designed for reliability, but December in Belgium tested every vehicle. Engines that wouldn't start in minus 15 Celsius temperatures required ground crews to heat them with portable stoves. Tracks froze to the ground during rest halts, requiring tank crews to rock their vehicles back and forth to break free. Ice formed in the fuel lines of vehicles that had been sitting, requiring precious time to thaw. The division's maintenance sections worked around the clock, fixing problems as they occurred, but some tanks simply could not continue. 2nd Armored Division began the movement with 186 Shermans. By the time Combat Command A reached the Celles area on December 26th morning, approximately 20 tanks had been left behind for mechanical reasons, reducing the available force to 166. Still a powerful formation, but 10% smaller than planned, and those 20 tanks represented experienced crews now unavailable for the coming fight. Combat Command A, leading 2nd Armored Division's deployment, arrived in positions north of Celles at dawn on December 26th. Colonel Hugh O'Farrell, the combat command leader, established his headquarters in a farmhouse and immediately coordinated with British forces already surrounding the village. The tactical situation was clear. German forces were trapped in Chelles. British tanks held positions west and north. American forces would attack from north and east. Combined artillery would support. O'Farrell divided his command into 3 task forces, each built around a tank company reinforced with armored infantry and supporting weapons. Task Force A would attack directly into Celles from the north. Task Force B would position east of the village to cut off any German withdrawal. Task Force A would remain in reserve to exploit success or respond to problems. The attack would begin after an artillery preparation, coordinated with British artillery to deliver maximum shock to the German defenders. The American soldiers who prepared to attack Celles on December 26 morning were different from the British forces already in position. Where British soldiers were 5-year veterans of a long war, many American soldiers had been in Europe only since summer 1944, experiencing 6 months of combat rather than 5 years. Where British soldiers were tired and cautious, wanting to survive until the clearly approaching end of the war, American soldiers were more aggressive and sometimes reckless, confident in their numerical and material superiority. Where British doctrine emphasized careful preparation, American doctrine emphasized rapid decision-making and exploiting opportunities. These differences would show in the coming battle. British tanks would provide fire support from hull-down positions, killing German tanks at long range with minimal exposure. American tanks would maneuver aggressively, accepting higher risks to close with the enemy and force a decision quickly. Neither approach was wrong. They simply reflected different military cultures shaped by different wartime experiences. The coordination meeting between O'Farrell and Brigadier Harvey on December the 25th had established division of responsibilities. but the actual battle would require continuous communication and adaptation. The two forces used different radio frequencies, different map coordinate systems, different terminology for the same things. Liaison officers were positioned at each headquarters to facilitate coordination, but confusion was inevitable. The plan was for British artillery to fire the initial preparation bombardment. Then American artillery would take over, while British guns shifted to blocking fires. British tanks would engage German positions from their established positions, while American tanks maneuvered closer. If this sounds complicated, it was. Coordinating two different armies, with different equipment and procedures, attacking the same objective simultaneously, was an invitation to fratricide and confusion. That it worked as well as it did was testament to the professionalism of both forces and the flexibility of small unit leaders who adapted to reality as they found it. Sergeant Caruso, in his Sherman tank, positioned 500 meters north of Celles, watched the artillery preparation begin at 0800 hours on December 26. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of outgoing artillery fire mixing with the crash of shells impacting in the village. Smoke and dust rose above Celles, obscuring visibility. Caruso's tank was part of Task Force A, assigned to advance into the village once the bombardment lifted. His crew conducted final checks. Main gun loaded with armor-piercing, machine guns loaded and ready, radio tuned to company frequency, engine running smoothly. Caruso had been a tank commander since Normandy, fought through France and Belgium, survived 6 months of combat that had killed 2 of his original crew members. He knew Sherman tanks were vulnerable to German guns, knew the Panthers and Panzer IVs in Celles could kill his tank before he could kill them. But he also knew that 2nd Armored Division had 3 tanks for every German tank, had unlimited artillery support, had air cover waiting if the weather stayed clear. The battle might be hard, but the outcome wasn't in doubt. The question was only how many Americans would die achieving the inevitable victory. At 0830 hours, the artillery preparation lifted, and Task Force A began its attack on Celles. Caruso's Sherman, part of a platoon of 5 tanks moving in staggered formation, advanced down the hill toward the village at 15 kilometers per hour, slow enough to maintain formation and control, fast enough to cross the open ground quickly. The lead tank was hit at 400 meters, a German Panther firing from a concealed position behind a stone wall. The Sherman brewed up instantly, ammunition exploding, crew bailing out if they were lucky. The platoon responded by spreading out, returning fire, calling for artillery on the German position. Caruso's tank fired 3 rounds at the stone wall, couldn't tell if they hit anything, kept moving. Another Sherman was hit. This one didn't explode but stopped moving, smoke pouring from the engine. The attack that looked simple on the map, advance across open ground, suppress German positions, enter the village, was proving costly within the first 5 minutes. But the attack continued because stopping in the open ground was more dangerous than continuing forward. Hell on Wheels was living up to its reputation, driving into enemy fire, taking casualties and pushing through because that was what armored divisions did. The Battle of Celles had entered its decisive phase, and American and British forces were about to discover that destroying a trapped enemy was still going to require fighting for every meter of ground. December 26, 1944, 0800 hours. The village of Celles erupts in fire and smoke as 180 Allied artillery pieces open their bombardment. Shells crash into buildings, collapsing stone walls that have stood for centuries, throwing roof tiles and timber into the streets. High explosive and white phosphorus mix in a storm of destruction designed to shatter German defenses before the ground attack begins. In a cellar beneath the village church, Major Ernst von Boom crouches with his command staff, feeling the building shake with each near miss, hearing the screaming of shells overhead. His radio operator is shouting into the microphone, trying to maintain contact with the defensive positions scattered through the village, but many lines are already dead, cut by the bombardment. Von Boom knows what this barrage means. The Allies have completed their preparation. The encirclement is tight. The relief column that was supposed to break through has either been destroyed or stopped. What happens in the next hours will determine whether his men die fighting or survive to become prisoners. Either way, Kampfgruppe von Boom's war is ending in this Belgian village. The bombardment lifts at 0830, shifting from the village to the approaches around it, creating a wall of fire designed to prevent German withdrawal or reinforcement. In the sudden relative quiet, German defenders emerge from their cellars and shelters, moving to their fighting positions. Panther tank crews scramble into their vehicles, starting engines that have been kept running intermittently through the night to prevent freezing. Infantry take positions in windows and behind walls. Machine guns are readied, anti-tank weapons prepared. The defenders can see Allied tanks on the ridgelines to the north and west, British Shermans and Cromwells in hull-down positions, and now movement to the north, American tanks advancing down the slope toward the village. Von Boom issues orders by radio to his unit commanders. Engage armor at maximum range, conserve ammunition, fight from covered positions, make the Americans pay for every meter. These are the tactics of desperate defense, the tactics of men who know they cannot win, but are determined to make victory expensive. Sergeant Michael Caruso's Sherman tank advances toward Selles as part of a platoon of 5 tanks in line formation, spacing approximately 75 meters between vehicles. The ground is open farmland, snow-covered, offering no concealment. 400 meters from the village edge, the first German gun fires. The Sherman 3 positions to Caruso's left is hit in the front glacis, the armor-piercing round penetrating, and the tank explodes as its ammunition cooks off. Caruso sees the crew hatches blow open, sees one figure emerge trailing flames, falling into the snow. His gunner is already traversing, searching for the German position. There, the angular shape of a Panther hull behind a stone wall. Caruso orders fire. The 75mm gun cracks, the Sherman rocks with the recoil, and the tracer from the round arcs toward the target. The shot hits the stone wall, throwing fragments but not penetrating to the tank behind. The Panther fires again, and another American Sherman is hit. This one stopping but not exploding, crew bailing out through the hatches. The mathematics of tank combat at Selles demonstrated why American forces accepted high casualties to achieve victories. German Panthers could penetrate Sherman armor at 1,000 meters. Shermans could only reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor at 500 meters or less, and only with perfect shots at weak points. This meant German tanks could kill American tanks before American tanks could effectively return fire. The solution was numerical superiority and combined arms. For every German tank in shells, there were 3 Allied tanks surrounding it. American tanks that were hit were immediately replaced by others pressing the attack. German tanks that fired revealed their positions and drew concentrated fire from multiple enemies simultaneously. Allied artillery plastered any position from which German fire came, forcing German tanks to move or be destroyed by indirect fire. The Panther that killed 2 American Shermans in the first minutes of the attack was itself destroyed 5 minutes later when 3 more Shermans maneuvered to flank it while British artillery dropped smoke on its position. By 0900 hours, American forces had pushed into the northern edge of Selles, infantry dismounting from their half-tracks, advancing alongside tanks in the combined arms tactics the U.S. Army had developed through painful experience. Every building had to be cleared, every intersection had to be secured. German infantry, dug in and fighting from prepared positions, made the Americans pay for each advance. A German machine gun team in a second-story window killed 4 American infantrymen before a Sherman tank blasted the building with high explosive rounds, collapsing the floor and burying the defenders. A German anti-tank team with a Panzerfaust destroyed an American tank at point-blank range when it advanced past their concealed position, then were killed by American infantry who threw grenades into their hiding place. The fighting was savage, close range, building to building, exactly the kind of combat that negated most technical advantages and came down to determination and numbers. From his command post in the church basement, von Bohm monitored the battle's progress through fragmentary radio reports. The northern perimeter was collapsing under American pressure. 3 Panthers destroyed, 2 more damaged and immobilized. Infantry casualties mounting, ammunition expenditure higher than expected. The eastern perimeter was under artillery fire but not yet attacked, Americans establishing positions rather than advancing. The western perimeter, facing British tanks, was exchanging long-range fire, German tanks firing from concealed positions, British tanks responding from hull-down positions on the ridgelines. Neither side achieving decisive results, but the British weren't pressing forward. They were content to contain while the Americans did the actual assaulting. Von Bohm understood the Allied strategy. The Americans would break into the village from the north, the British would prevent withdrawal to the west. Combined artillery would interdict any German movement. It was methodical, professional, and utterly overwhelming. Belgian civilians, approximately 300 people including children and elderly, remained in their cellars. Throughout the battle, terrified by the sounds above them, Marie Jeanne de Bien, a farmer's wife whose family had lived in chalets for 4 generations, huddled with her 3 children in the stone-vaulted cellar of their farmhouse, listening to explosions shaking the building, hearing the sharp crack of tank guns and the rattle of machine gun fire. At mid-morning, wounded German soldiers were brought into the cellar. The farmhouse was being used as an aid station. Marie and her neighbors tended the wounded as best they could with limited supplies, offering water, applying bandages, trying to provide comfort to men who were dying far from their homes. The Germans were polite even in their agony, thanking the Belgians for help, apologizing for the invasion that had brought war to their village. This was the human reality beneath the tactical maneuvers and strategic calculations. Ordinary people caught in extraordinary violence, trying to maintain humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. By noon on December 26th, Combat Command A had pushed halfway through Celles, controlling the northern third of the village, but facing increasingly desperate German resistance in the center. The fighting had become methodical destruction. American tanks would advance to an intersection, fire into buildings where Germans might be hiding. Infantry would move up to clear the ruins, then the process would repeat at the next intersection. Casualties on both sides accumulated steadily. 2nd Armored Division lost 16 tanks destroyed and another dozen damaged in the morning's fighting. German forces lost 8 tanks destroyed and approximately 100 men killed or wounded. The casualty exchange rate favored the defenders. Germans were killing more Americans per German lost. But the strategic situation favored the attackers who could replace losses, while the Germans could not. The decisive moment came at 1400 hours when American forces broke through to the village center. Sander and British tanks began advancing from the west, squeezing the German defenders into an ever smaller pocket. Von Boom, recognizing that continued resistance would only increase casualties without changing the outcome, radioed his unit commanders, "Prepare to cease fire and surrender on my order." Some commanders acknowledged, others did not respond, their radios destroyed or their positions already overrun. Von Boom made a final attempt to contact division headquarters, requesting permission to surrender to prevent further unnecessary deaths. The response, when it finally came through the static and interference, was terse: hold as long as possible, no surrender authorized. Von Boom made his decision. He would follow his orders to hold as long as possible. He would interpret "as long as possible" to mean as long as organized resistance was feasible. That time was approaching rapidly. December 27th, 1944. The battle entered its 2nd day with German resistance collapsing in sectors, but continuing fiercely in others. Individual German tank crews fought from immobilized vehicles, unable to maneuver but still capable of firing. Infantry positions held out in pockets, surrounded, cut off, fighting because surrender seemed more dangerous than continued resistance. American and British forces tightened the noose methodically, using artillery to blast positions that resisted, bypassing strong points when possible, gradually reducing the German-held area to a few city blocks around the church. By 1000 hours on December 27th, von Bohm's effective fighting force had been reduced to approximately 200 men and 6 operational tanks. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone, wounded men lying in cellars with no treatment available. Food and water were running low. The civilians were in desperate condition, terrified and traumatized by 2 days of continuous combat above their shelters. At 1400 hours on December 27, von Bohm ordered white flags displayed on the remaining German positions. The firing gradually ceased as both sides recognized that organized resistance had ended. American and British soldiers advanced cautiously into the German-held sector, weapons ready, expecting traps or last-minute resistance. Instead, they found exhausted German soldiers emerging from ruins, hands raised, some wounded, and requiring assistance to walk. Von Bohm formally surrendered his command to an American colonel, turning over his sidearm, providing a list of his surviving personnel to the best of his knowledge. The Battle of Chenogne was over. Kampfgruppe von Boom had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The final accounting took days to compile completely. German losses: 82 tanks and assault guns destroyed or captured, approximately 150 killed, 450 captured, perhaps 20 escaped on foot through the Allied lines during the night. Allied losses: 28 tanks destroyed, 19 American and 9 British, 140 casualties killed and wounded combined. The exchange rate in tanks, 3 Allied tanks lost for every German tank destroyed, looked favorable to the Germans until you considered that Allied tanks could be replaced within days, while German tanks could not be replaced at all. The strategic impact was even more lopsided. 2nd Panzer Division had lost its spearhead entirely. The furthest German penetration had been identified, surrounded, and annihilated. The Meuse River crossings remained in Allied hands. The road to Antwerp was blocked permanently. Hitler's last offensive in the west had reached its high water mark at Celles and broken there like a wave hitting rocks. Belgian civilians emerged from their cellars on December 28th to find their village devastated. Buildings were rubble, streets were cratered by shells. Burned-out tanks sat where they had been destroyed, some still smoldering. The dead, German and Allied, lay where they had fallen until Graves registration units could collect them. 23 Belgian civilians had been killed during the battle, caught by shells or crushed by collapsing buildings despite their efforts to shelter. Marie Gendebien's farmhouse still stood, its walls pockmarked by shell fragments but structurally intact. She and her family had survived. Many of her neighbors had not. The village of Celles would be rebuilt over the following years, but the memory of those 2 days in December 1944 would never fade. The battle had been fought in their homes, over their land, and the cost had been borne not just by the soldiers who chose to fight, but by the civilians who had no choice but to endure. December 27, 1944, 2000 hours. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. The operations room is crowded with staff officers gathered around a large map of the Ardennes, updating unit positions based on the day's reports. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, stands before the map studying the German salient that bulges into Allied lines. The deepest penetration is marked with a red pin at Celles, 65 kilometers from the German start line, 80 kilometers short of the objective at Antwerp. An intelligence officer briefs the situation. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, destroyed at Celles, main body under heavy pressure, fuel exhausted, no capability to continue offensive operations. Eisenhower asks the critical question: is this the end of the German offensive, or can they renew the attack? The intelligence assessment is clear. The offensive is finished. German forces are transitioning to defense. The crisis has passed. Eisenhower nods, absorbing the information, then issues orders. Maintain pressure, begin counteroffensive preparations, exploit German weakness. The Battle of the Bulge is entering its final phase, shifting from desperate Allied defense to methodical German destruction. The map at SHAEF headquarters told the story in visual form. The German salient at its maximum extent on December 25th resembled a bulge approximately 100 kilometers wide and 65 kilometers deep, hence the name Battle of the Bulge that would stick in popular memory. Within that bulge, German forces had achieved tactical successes, surrounding American units at Bastogne and St. Vith, breaking through multiple defensive lines, advancing further and faster than Allied intelligence had believed possible. But they had not achieved their strategic objectives. They had not crossed the Meuse River. They had not captured Antwerp. They had not split the Allied armies. They had not forced a negotiated peace. The offensive had created a temporary crisis, but had not fundamentally changed the strategic situation. Now, with German fuel exhausted and Allied reserves arriving in strength, the bulge would be reduced, German forces driven back, and the offensive that was supposed to change the war would instead accelerate Germany's defeat. At Adolf Hitler's headquarters, the Adlerhorst bunker complex, the December 28th briefing presented very different information to very different effect. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKB, reported losses from the Ardennes Offensive, approximately 68,000 casualties, 450 tanks destroyed or abandoned, offensive capabilities exhausted. The Meuse River was not reached. Antwerp was not threatened. The The strategic objective had failed. Hitler listened in silence, his hands trembling more noticeably than usual, his face drawn. When Keitel finished, Hitler asked about ammunition and fuel reserves for continuing operations. The answer was brutal. Ammunition stocks were critically low after the massive expenditure of the offensive's first week. Fuel production remained at catastrophically low levels. Replacement equipment was unavailable. Germany could defend but could not attack. Hitler authorized transition to defensive operations, but refused to authorize withdrawal from the salient. German forces would hold their gains as long as possible, making the Allies pay for every kilometer they retook. The strategic implications of Chelles extended far beyond the destruction of one German battalion. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance unit represented approximately 6% of the total German armor committed to the Ardennes Offensive. 82 tanks out of 1,400. But those 82 tanks were at the spear point, the furthest advance, the closest approach to success. Their destruction demonstrated to both German and Allied commands that the offensive had definitively failed. No relief was coming, no breakthrough was possible. The maximum extent of German advance was now known and marked. Everything from this point forward would be retreat and containment. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. Officers who had executed the offensive, believing it might succeed, now understood it had failed. Soldiers who had advanced believing they might reach the Meuse now understood they would not. The combination of material exhaustion and psychological deflation transformed the German army from offensive force to defensive force overnight. General George Patton, commanding U.S. Third Army south of the German salient, recognized the opportunity immediately. On December 28, he ordered his forces to accelerate their counteroffensive north toward Bastogne and the southern edge of the German penetration. Patton's army had already been wheeling north since December 22nd, executing one of the more impressive operational maneuvers of the war, repositioning 6 divisions 90 degrees from their advance into Germany to strike the German flank in the Ardennes. Now, with German offensive power broken at Tours, Selles, and elsewhere, Patton's counteroffensive could transition from emergency response to exploitation. Third Army would drive north, link up with forces at Bastogne, cut off German units still in the salient, and begin the systematic destruction of German forces that had overextended themselves. The same mobility that had allowed the German advance would now enable their destruction, as Allied forces cut supply lines and isolated forward units. The battle's impact on civilian populations was catastrophic and largely forgotten in the strategic analysis. The Ardennes region, relatively untouched by fighting since May 1940, had experienced 4 years of German occupation, followed by liberation in September 1944. Civilians had endured both but survived. The December offensive brought the war back with terrible intensity. Entire villages were destroyed in the fighting. Tens of thousands of Belgian and Luxembourg civilians became refugees, fleeing west ahead of the German advance, many losing everything they owned. American soldiers, retreating in disorder during the first days of the offensive, had destroyed supplies and equipment to prevent capture, leaving civilians without food or shelter in the middle of winter. German forces, advancing with minimal supplies, had requisitioned food and vehicles from civilians, often at gunpoint. The villages that became battlefields, places like Selles, were devastated by the fighting. Even after the battle moved on, the civilian suffering continued, homes destroyed, winter cold, food shortages, unexploded ordnance making fields and roads dangerous. The lessons learned from Chelles would influence Allied military doctrine for decades. The importance of maintaining mobile reserves became doctrine. Montgomery's positioning of British X-Corps had proven decisive in blocking the German advance. The value of air-ground coordination was reinforced. The moment weather cleared and Allied aircraft could fly, German logistics collapsed. The necessity of adequate supply lines was demonstrated negatively by German failure and positively by Allied success. American forces moved divisions hundreds of kilometers and arrived ready to fight because their logistics functioned. These lessons would be codified in post-war planning, particularly for NATO strategy during the Cold War, when the primary threat scenario was Soviet armored breakthrough in Central Europe. The Battle of Chelles became a case study in how to respond to breakthrough, maintain reserves, control key terrain like river crossings, use air power against exposed supply lines, counterattack quickly with concentrated force. December 31st, 1944. New Year's Eve. 2 weeks after the German offensive began, 1 week after the Battle of Chenogne ended, Allied forces were systematically reducing the German salient. American 1st and 3rd armies were attacking from north and south, squeezing the Bulge, driving German forces back toward their start line. British forces maintained pressure in the north, preventing German attempts to break through to the Meuse. The weather had turned bitterly cold, with snow and ice making operations difficult for both sides. But the momentum had shifted decisively. German forces were retreating, often in disorder, abandoning equipment they lacked fuel to move, leaving wounded behind for lack of medical supplies. The Ardennes Offensive that was supposed to change the war was instead accelerating its end. By mid-January, German forces would be back approximately where they started, having lost irreplaceable men and equipment, having consumed fuel and ammunition stocks that could not be replaced, having demonstrated to their own soldiers and the world that Germany could no longer win the war. The Battle of Chenogne marked the precise moment when the Ardennes Offensive transitioned from threat to failure, though it would take another 3 weeks of fighting to fully eliminate the salient. Von Boehm's reconnaissance battalion, reaching 5 kilometers from the Meuse, represented the furthest German penetration. The fact that they were surrounded and destroyed without ever crossing the river represented the definitive limit of German capability. Everything beyond Chenogne had been fantasy. The plans to cross the Meuse, drive to Brussels, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies. Reality ended at Chenogne, in a Belgian village where 600 German soldiers discovered that courage and skill could not overcome empty fuel tanks and overwhelming enemy numbers. The high water mark of Nazi Germany's last offensive was measured not by how far they advanced, but by how far short of their objectives they fell. 65 kilometers gained, 125 kilometers required. The difference between those numbers measured the difference between Hitler's delusions and the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare. Historians would debate for decades whether the Ardennes Offensive had any real chance of success, or was doomed from conception. The answer depended on how success was defined. If success meant reaching Antwerp and fundamentally changing the strategic situation, the offensive was impossible from the start. Germany lacked the fuel, the logistics, and the air cover to sustain such an advance even if initial breakthroughs succeeded. If success meant temporarily disrupting Allied plans and delaying the final invasion of Germany by a few months, the offensive might have achieved more with better execution. But even that limited success required everything to go right. Maintaining surprise, achieving rapid breakthrough, capturing American fuel, keeping weather bad enough to ground Allied aircraft, and Allied command responding slowly. In reality, almost nothing went right after the first 48 hours. American units that were supposed to collapse fought desperately. Fuel dumps that were supposed to be captured were destroyed. Weather that was supposed to stay bad cleared. Allied reserves that were supposed to be slow arrived quickly. The result was Chenogne, German forces reaching their furthest extent and dying there, trapped by their own success in a village they had captured but could not hold or retreat from. The New Year's Eve that closed 1944 found the soldiers who had fought at Chenogne in very different circumstances. German survivors were in prisoner of war camps, beginning the process of interrogation and eventual return to Germany long after the war ended. Many would not see their homes for years. American and British soldiers were still in the line, still fighting to reduce the German salient, still enduring winter cold and continuing casualties. There was no celebration of victory at Chenogne, because the battle was just one small engagement in a larger campaign that was still ongoing. But the soldiers who had been there understood they had participated in something significant. They had been at the furthest point of the German advance. They had stopped Hitler's last offensive. They had been present at the moment when the tide turned definitively and irrevocably against Nazi Germany. That knowledge, though it would take years for its full significance to be recognized, was its own kind of victory. December 26, 1944, 1300 hours. The field outside Chenogne where destroyed and abandoned German tanks sit in silent rows, testimony to the morning's combat. An American ordnance officer, Captain Robert Hendricks, walks among the wrecks conducting damage assessment, recording the types of vehicles, the nature of the damage, attempting to understand what killed each tank. He stops beside a Panther, its turret traversed at an odd angle, a penetration hole visible in the frontal armor where an Allied round punched through. The hole is too large for a standard 75mm Sherman gun. Hendricks checks his notes. British Firefly with 17-pounder gun hit at approximately 800 meters. The Panther's crew is still inside, killed by the round that penetrated, and the spalling that filled the crew compartment with metal fragments traveling at supersonic speed. Hendricks orders the bodies removed for burial, then moves to the next vehicle. This is the grim arithmetic of armored warfare. Excellent tanks crewed by skilled men, destroyed because the enemy had more tanks and better positions. The technical specifications of the tanks that fought at Selles told a story of German quality versus Allied quantity. The Panther tank, Germany's main battle tank by late 1944, mounted a 75mm KGB-42 gun that could penetrate 120mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Its frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, providing effective protection of approximately 140mm against kinetic penetrators. Maximum speed was 46 km per hour on roads, though rarely achieved under combat conditions. The Panther represented the cutting edge of German tank design, incorporating lessons learned from encountering Soviet T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front. It was arguably the best medium tank of World War II in terms of firepower and protection. It was also mechanically complex, fuel-hungry, and difficult to produce in quantity. Germany managed to produce approximately 6,000 Panthers between 1943 and 1945. Impressive for a nation under strategic bombardment, but tiny compared to Allied production. The Sherman M4, the standard American medium tank at Selles, presented a stark contrast. Its 75mm M3 gun could penetrate 60mm of armor at 1,000 meters, less than half the Panther's penetration capability. Its frontal armor was 51mm, unsloped, providing protection adequate against German anti-tank guns from 1940, but inadequate against the high-velocity guns of 1944. Maximum speed was 40 km per hour, slightly slower than the Panther. In every technical specification that mattered for tank versus tank combat, the Sherman was inferior to the Panther. Yet the United States produced approximately 50,000 Shermans during the war, roughly 8 times German Panther production. This numerical superiority was the deliberate result of American strategic calculation: produce adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers rather than excellent tanks in limited quantities. The Sherman was designed for reliability and ease of production, using a Continental radial aircraft engine that was produced in huge numbers for other purposes, mounted in a simple hull that could be manufactured quickly. The British contribution to Allied armor at Selles was the Sherman Firefly, a British modification of the American Sherman that replaced the 75mm gun with the British 17-pounder gun. This weapon could penetrate 130mm of armor at 1,000 meters, making it roughly equivalent to the Panther's gun and superior to anything else the Western Allies fielded. The Firefly represented British pragmatism. Recognizing that American-supplied Shermans were inadequate for fighting German heavy tanks, British engineers redesigned the turret to accommodate the larger gun, creating a hybrid vehicle that combined American mechanical reliability with British firepower. At Selles, the 12 Fireflies in British service accounted for approximately 20 of the 82 German tanks destroyed, a disproportionate impact relative to their numbers. The Firefly's presence was also psychological. German tankers quickly learned to identify and prioritize Fireflies as threats, meaning Firefly crews faced concentrated German fire once their vehicles were identified. The actual mechanics of tank combat at Selles demonstrated why technical specifications didn't determine outcomes. German Panthers could kill Shermans at 1,000 meters, but the battle occurred in a village and surrounding farmland where engagement ranges were typically 400 to 600 meters. At those ranges, German firepower advantage was reduced though still present. More critically, German tanks were defending from static positions while Allied tanks were maneuvering with infantry support and artillery coordination. A German Panther in a prepared position behind a stone wall might have excellent fields of fire, but once Allied forces identified its position, they could bring overwhelming firepower to bear, multiple tanks engaging from different angles, artillery plastering the position with high explosive, infantry maneuvering to attack from the flanks. The Panther's superior armor protected against frontal hits, but hits from the side or rear were lethal, and in village fighting, flank shots were common. Mechanical reliability emerged as a decisive factor that technical specifications didn't capture. German tanks, particularly Panthers, suffered chronic mechanical problems. The transmission, overworked by the tank's 45-ton weight, failed frequently, particularly in cold weather. The final drives that connected the transmission to the tracks were notoriously fragile, wearing out after only several hundred kilometers of operation. Engine cooling was inadequate, leading to overheating in summer and difficulty starting in winter. At Celles, approximately 20% of German tanks lost were abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than enemy fire. These tanks could not be recovered because Germany lacked the fuel to operate recovery vehicles and the spare parts to repair failures. By contrast, American Shermans, though technically inferior, were remarkably reliable. The Continental R975 radial engine was simple and robust. The transmission was adequately strong for the tank's weight. Maintenance procedures were straightforward and well documented. Sherman tanks that were damaged could be recovered by M32 tank recovery vehicles and repaired in field workshops, often returning to service within days. At Celles, virtually every Sherman lost was due to enemy fire, not mechanical failure, and even some of those were repaired and returned to service after the battle. Crew survivability was another factor where the Sherman showed surprising advantages despite its inferior armor. The Sherman's ammunition storage was in the hull bottom, protected by water jackets that reduced the risk of catastrophic explosion when penetrated. The crew positions were relatively spacious, allowing quick escape through multiple hatches. Post-battle analysis of knocked-out Shermans at Celles showed crew survival rates of approximately 80%. 4 out of 5 crew members typically escaped even when the tank was destroyed. Panther crews, by contrast, faced more difficult escape conditions. The ammunition was stored vertically along the hull sides, meaning penetrations often ignited the ammunition immediately. The turret crew positions were cramped, the hatches smaller and harder to escape through quickly. Panther crew survival rates at Celles were approximately 65%, better than earlier German tanks but worse than Shermans. This meant that even when Germans achieved favorable kill ratios and tanks destroyed, they suffered proportionally higher personnel casualties, and trained tank crews were harder to replace than tanks themselves. The tactical adaptation both sides made during the battle revealed professional competence trying to overcome material realities. German tank commanders at Celles used every advantage their superior vehicles provided, engaging at maximum range, seeking hull-down positions, coordinating with infantry anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts to engage American tanks that penetrated the village. But they were constrained by lack of fuel to maneuver, lack of ammunition to sustain long engagements, and lack of infantry support to protect their flanks. Allied tank commanders adapted by refusing to play the Germans' game. Instead of engaging Panthers frontally at range where German guns had advantage, they used artillery smoke to close the distance, maneuvered to flank positions, used combined arms with infantry clearing buildings, while tanks provided fire support. The tactics were less elegant than German armored doctrine, but more effective under the actual circumstances of the battle. The fuel consumption differential between German and Allied tanks provided final quantitative measure of why Germany lost at Celles despite superior equipment. A Panther consumed approximately 2 liters per kilometer under combat conditions. The 82 Panthers and other German tanks at Celles, having advanced 90 kilometers from their start line, had consumed roughly 14,000 liters of fuel. They needed approximately 10,000 more liters to reach the Meuse River and return. Total requirement, 24,000 liters. Actual fuel available, approximately 800 liters. The mathematics were impossible. By contrast, American Shermans consumed approximately 1.3 liters per kilometer. The 166 American tanks that attacked Celles traveled 60 kilometers from Havelange, consuming roughly 13,000 liters. Their supply trucks delivered 50,000 liters to forward positions, ensuring multiple refills available. British tanks had similar abundance. The battle was decided not by which tanks had better guns or armor, but by which side had enough fuel to move and fight. Germany had superior technology. The Allies had working logistics. Logistics won. Post-battle analysis conducted by American and British intelligence officers produced detailed reports on German tank vulnerabilities that would inform tactics for the EU. Remainder of the war. The Panther's side armor, though sloped, was only 45 millimeters thick and vulnerable to flanking shots. The engine deck was vulnerable to high explosive rounds that could damage cooling systems even without penetrating. The cupola on the turret, used by the tank commander, was a weak point that skilled gunners could target, but the reports also emphasized that frontal engagement of Panthers by standard Shermans was to be avoided when possible. The recommended tactic was maneuver and numerical superiority. Fix the Panther frontally with one tank, while others maneuvered to flanks. Use artillery and airstrikes when available. Coordinate with infantry to prevent German tanks from maneuvering freely. These were the tactics that had worked at Shells. They would continue working until the war ended, because they accepted technical inferiority and compensated with operational superiority. The steel that met in combat at Selles represented two different industrial philosophies encountering each other with lethal consequences. German steel was forged in the belief that quality and technical excellence would overcome numerical disadvantage, that superior weapons operated by skilled soldiers could defeat mass production. Allied steel embodied the opposite philosophy. Adequate quality produced in overwhelming quantity, backed by logistics that ensured every vehicle could be supplied and maintained, wielded by soldiers trained in combined arms tactics that magnified the impact of individually inferior equipment. Both philosophies had merit in abstract. In concrete reality, at Selles in December 1944, one worked and one didn't. The graveyard of German tanks in the fields around the village testified to which philosophy had proven correct under the actual conditions of modern industrialized warfare. Excellence without logistics was just expensive scrap metal. Adequacy with logistics was victory. 1949, the United States Army Center of Military History, Washington, D.C. Historians working on the official history of the European campaign gather around tables covered with maps, after-action reports, and interview transcripts. They are constructing the narrative that will become the definitive American account of World War II in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge will occupy a major section, but decisions must be made about emphasis and length. The Siege of Bastogne receives 40 pages of detailed narrative. The stand of the 101st Airborne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous Nuts reply to German surrender demands, the relief by Patton's Third Army, these make compelling stories of American determination against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Selles receives 4 pages, a brief mention of 2nd Panzer Division's destruction, acknowledgement of British participation, no detailed tactical narrative. The decision reflects practical constraints of space and narrative flow, but it also begins the process by which Selles would disappear from popular memory while Bastogne became legendary. The asymmetry of historical memory is not random, but shaped by narrative needs and national mythologies. Bastogne fit perfectly into American self-conception. Surrounded and outnumbered, asked to surrender, responding with defiant monosyllable, holding until relieved by American reinforcements. The story required no caveats, no sharing credit, no complex coordination with allies. It was pure American heroism in easily digestible form. Selles, by contrast, was complicated. The German spearhead was stopped, not by American forces alone, but by British reserves arriving first, establishing the encirclement, holding positions while Americans attacked. The destruction of 2nd Panzer Division required coordination between 2 different armies with different equipment and procedures. The battle was methodical rather than desperate, professional execution rather than last-stand drama. These complexities made Selles less suitable for the heroic narratives that nations prefer when remembering their wars. 1965. Bastogne, Belgium. Dedication ceremony for the Mardasson Memorial, a massive star-shaped monument commemorating American forces in the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands attend, including veterans of the 101st Airborne, Belgian officials, American military leadership. General Anthony McAuliffe, now retired, participates in the ceremony, his wartime defiance remembered and celebrated. The same day, in Selles, a much smaller ceremony takes place. Approximately 80 people, mostly local Belgians, and a handful of British veterans, gather at a modest memorial stone marking the battle site. No American officials attend, no national media coverage. The ceremony lasts 20 minutes, then the attendees disperse. The contrast between these two commemorations, occurring simultaneously 70 kilometers apart, illustrates how historical significance and historical memory can diverge completely. Bastogne was remembered. Selles was forgotten. The British perspective on Selles adds another layer to the memory problem. British official histories of World War II emphasize different campaigns than American histories. North Africa, the Mediterranean, the liberation of Northern Europe where British forces played leading roles. The Ardennes Offensive, occurring after the failed Market Garden operation and during the Winter Stalemate, was not a highlight of British operations in Europe. British forces played supporting role, providing reserves that contained the German breakthrough, but not delivering the decisive blow that came from American counteroffensives. British historians acknowledge Selles as a successful defensive action, but did not emphasize it because doing so might seem like claiming credit for American success in the broader battle. The result was British histories that mentioned Selles briefly, usually in the context of ex-corps operations, without extensive tactical detail or analysis. German perspectives on Selles were shaped by post-war desire to move past Nazi era while honoring the memory of soldiers who fought. 2nd Panzer Division veterans, those who survived the war, gathered occasionally for reunions in the 1950s and 60s. They remembered Selles as the end of their division's proud history, the place where an elite unit was destroyed through circumstances beyond their control. The narrative they constructed emphasized fuel shortage as decisive factor, absolving themselves of tactical failure by pointing to strategic impossibility. This was partially true. Fuel shortage was indeed decisive, but it also avoided discussing whether the advance to Selles had been wise, whether defensive positions short of the village might have been more prudent, whether the order to push forward regardless of logistics had been properly questioned. The discomfort of these questions meant German veterans preferred not to discuss Selles extensively, contributing to its fade from historical consciousness. The few historians who examined Selles closely in subsequent decades recognized its strategic significance. The battle marked the furthest point of German advance, the moment when offensive transformed to defensive, the demonstration that Hitler's gamble had failed. Militarily, Selles was more important than Bastogne. Bastogne was a road junction whose control mattered, but whose loss would not have fundamentally changed the campaign's outcome. Selles was the spear point that had to reach the Meuse, or the offensive failed. The destruction of 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion proved the offensive had failed. By that metric, Selles should be remembered as the decisive engagement of the Battle of the Bulge. Yet scholarly argument about strategic significance could not overcome popular preference for heroic narrative. Bastogne remained the famous battle. Selles remained obscure. The role of media in shaping historical memory cannot be overstated. Bastogne was covered extensively by war correspondents in real time. The siege, the surrounded American forces, the relief column racing to save them, these provided perfect material for dramatic reporting. Journalists could visit Bastogne after its relief, interview veterans, photograph damaged buildings, and destroyed equipment. The stories written in late December 1944 and early January 1945 established Bastogne in public consciousness immediately. Selles, occurring simultaneously, but in a sector where fewer American correspondents were present, received minimal contemporary coverage. By the time journalists reached Selles in late December, the battle was over, the German prisoners removed, the damaged buildings no more dramatic than dozens of other villages destroyed in the Ardennes fighting. Without contemporary press coverage establishing its significance, Selles never entered popular awareness the way Bastogne did. The veterans who fought at Selles had mixed feelings about the battle's obscurity. Some American soldiers who participated felt that their contribution had been unfairly overlooked, that the difficult fighting to destroy the German spearhead deserved recognition equal to defending Bastogne. Others accepted that history is selective and that not every significant action receives public recognition. British veterans generally felt less concern about recognition, many of them having fought through North Africa and Italy in campaigns that also received limited American attention. German veterans, those few who discussed the battle openly, seemed almost relieved that Selles was forgotten. The battle represented comprehensive defeat, the destruction of an elite unit, the end of their division's proud history. If the world wanted to forget Selles, they were not inclined to remind it. Belgian civilians of Selles and surrounding villages never forgot the battle that destroyed their homes and killed their neighbors. Every December, a small ceremony is held at the village memorial, attended primarily by local residents and a dwindling number of veterans. The Belgian government maintains a museum in Bastogne that receives thousands of visitors annually, commemorating the broader battle. A much smaller display in the Selles Village Hall documents the local battle, visited by perhaps hundreds annually, mostly military history enthusiasts who specifically seek it out. The asymmetry is stark. Marie Gendebien, the farmer's wife who sheltered wounded soldiers in her cellar during the battle, lived until 1998. In her later years, she would occasionally speak to school groups about her experiences, trying to ensure that local history was not completely forgotten. Her testimony was preserved by Belgian historians, but it never reached the wider audience that American oral histories of Bastogne achieved. The question of why history remembers some battles and forgets others has no simple answer. Narrative appeal matters. Desperate last stands are more compelling than methodical destruction of surrounded enemies. National myth-making matters. Each nation remembers battles that reinforce its self-conception. Timing matters. Events that receive immediate attention establish themselves in collective memory in ways that later scholarship cannot easily displace. Media coverage matters. Battles that contemporary journalists emphasize become famous. Those they overlook remain obscure. The combination of these factors meant Bastogne would be remembered and celebrated, while Selles would fade into the specialized knowledge of military historians and local Belgians. Both battles mattered. Both were fought by courageous soldiers facing desperate circumstances. Both had significant impacts on the war's outcome, but only one entered the pantheon of famous battles. The other became the battle history, forgot, known only to those who took the time to look beyond the famous names and discover what actually happened in those critical days of December 1944. December 20th, 1944. The Trianon Palace Hotel, Versailles, France. General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters occupies the ornate building that once hosted French royalty, now transformed into the nerve center of Allied operations in Western Europe. Eisenhower faces the most difficult command decision of the war. The German offensive has broken through in the Ardennes, splitting his forces geographically into two groups separated by the German salient. American 1st Army and 9th Army, north of the breakthrough, are physically cut off from Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters to the south. Communication is difficult. Coordination is complicated. Eisenhower makes the decision that will cause controversy for months afterward. He places American 1st and 9th Armies temporarily under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's operational control. The military logic is sound. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters is closer, communication is easier, command unity is essential during crisis. The political implications are explosive. American forces, fighting an American battle, will take orders from a British field marshal who has repeatedly criticized American strategy and leadership. Montgomery receives the news at his headquarters in Belgium with satisfaction that he attempts but fails to conceal completely. For months, Montgomery has argued that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was wrong, that a concentrated thrust under single command, Montgomery's command, was the correct approach to defeating Germany. Eisenhower has consistently overruled these arguments, maintaining that political necessity required roughly equal roles for American and British forces, that logistics favored multiple axes of advance, that concentration was dangerous if it failed. Now, crisis has forced exactly the command arrangement Montgomery wanted, at least temporarily. Montgomery issues orders to his subordinate commanders. British ex-corps will move to protect the Meuse River crossings, establishing defensive line from Givet to Liège. American forces under his temporary command will contract their lines, establish strong defensive positions, prepare methodical counter-offensive once German momentum is exhausted. These are sensible orders based on Montgomery's defensive expertise. They are also orders that American commanders resent receiving from British superior, particularly when those orders involve giving up ground that Americans died capturing. General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, receives news of the command change at his headquarters in Luxembourg City with barely controlled fury. Bradley is 51 years old, West Point graduate, professional soldier who has commanded American forces through North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the advance across France. He considers Montgomery a prima donna, overly cautious, too concerned with British prestige, insufficiently appreciative of American contributions. The command change feels like public rebuke, suggestion that American leadership has failed. Bradley protests to Eisenhower, the command change is unnecessary, his headquarters can maintain communication with First Army. The arrangement gives Montgomery credit for American success when the counteroffensive begins. Eisenhower is sympathetic but unmoved. Military necessity trumps national pride. The temporary arrangement stands until the German salient is reduced and normal command relationships can resume. General George Patton, commanding Third Army, is already driving north toward Bastogne when he learns of Montgomery's expanded command. Patton's reaction is volcanic profanity, followed by grim determination to make Montgomery's role as irrelevant as possible. If British forces are protecting the northern flank, Third Army will smash through from the south, relieve Bastogne, cut off the German penetration, and demonstrate American offensive capability. Patton's army executes one of the war's most impressive operational maneuvers, pivoting 6 divisions 90 degrees from their eastward advance into Germany to drive north into the German flank. This requires moving approximately 130,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles over icy roads in winter weather, coordinating fuel and ammunition supply for forces changing direction, maintaining unit cohesion during movement. That Third Army accomplishes this in 72 hours, demonstrates American operational competence that equals anything Montgomery has achieved. It also demonstrates Patton's determination to ensure that when the Ardennes battle is remembered, American contributions will dominate the narrative. The tension between Montgomery and American commanders comes to a head on January 7, 1945, when Montgomery holds a press conference at his headquarters. Speaking to assembled journalists, Montgomery explains the battle from his perspective. German breakthrough created dangerous situation. British forces moved quickly to stabilize northern flank. He took command of American forces in the north and directed their successful defense. The crisis has been managed. Counteroffensive is proceeding. The content is largely accurate. The tone is insufferable. Montgomery speaks as though British forces saved Americans from German onslaught, as though his command genius retrieved American failure. The British press runs headlines emphasizing Montgomery's role. American press officers monitoring British coverage are apoplectic. American soldiers did the actual fighting and dying. British forces, while helpful, played supporting role. Now Montgomery is claiming primary credit. The American response is immediate and fierce. Bradley and Patton both threaten resignation if Montgomery is not publicly corrected. American press officers leak stories emphasizing American casualties versus British. Over 80,000 American casualties in the Ardennes versus approximately 1,400 British. Eisenhower, caught between allies, attempts damage control, issuing statements praising both American and British contributions, emphasizing Allied unity, minimizing command controversy. But the damage is done. American commanders will spend the remaining months of the war determined to minimize British role in final operations, to ensure that American forces lead the advance into Germany, to demonstrate that American military capability needs no British supervision. The command controversy that began with military necessity in December 1944 will poison Allied cooperation through the war's end. The Battle of Chenogne becomes entangled in this controversy in ways that distort its historical memory. British historians and press emphasize that British 29th Armored Brigade arrived first, established the encirclement, held positions throughout the battle. This is accurate. British accounts sometimes minimize American 2nd Armored Division's role in actually destroying the German force, suggesting that containment was the decisive action, and the assault merely cleaned up an already defeated enemy. This is less accurate, but serves the British narrative that Montgomery's quick deployment of reserves was decisive. American historians and press emphasize that American forces destroyed the German spearhead, that British forces provided useful support, but Americans did the fighting, that casualties reflect who bore the burden. This is also accurate, but sometimes minimizes the British timing advantage that prevented German forces from escaping before American forces arrived. The truth is that both forces were essential, that coordination between them worked reasonably well under difficult circumstances, that the battle demonstrated Allied cooperation at tactical level, even while command relationships were poisoned at strategic level. The casualty statistics from Chenogne provide objective measure of relative contributions, but are subject to interpretation. American forces, 19 tanks destroyed, approximately 90 casualties killed and wounded. British forces, 9 tanks destroyed, approximately 50 casualties. By these numbers, Americans suffered roughly twice the losses of British forces, reflecting that American tanks conducted the assault, while British tanks provided support by fire, but German forces destroyed by each. Approximately 50 tanks destroyed by American action, 30 tanks destroyed by British action, with some ambiguity about which nationality deserves credit for, tanks destroyed by combined action or surrendered rather than destroyed. Both nations' forces inflicted significant damage on the enemy. Neither could have achieved the victory alone with the same speed and minimal friendly casualties. This is the reality that command controversy obscured. General Harmon, commanding 2nd Armored Division at Selles, and Brigadier Harvey, commanding British 29th Armored Brigade, maintained professional relationship throughout the battle and afterward. In their after-action reports and private correspondence, both praised the other's forces and cooperation. Harmon acknowledged that British early arrival had fixed the German force in place, preventing withdrawal or reinforcement. Harvey acknowledged that American assault had taken the significant risks and casualties required to actually destroy the trapped enemy. This professional mutual respect at tactical level contrasted sharply with the acrimony at strategic level, where Bradley, Patton, and Montgomery were locked in ongoing conflict about credit and command. The disparity illustrates how command controversy can distort historical understanding when generals' egos obscure soldiers' cooperation. The long-term impact of the command controversy extended far beyond the Battle of the Bulge. Post-war, when NATO was formed and required integrated command structure, combining American and European forces, the Ardennes experience influenced planning. The decision was made that NATO would have American supreme commander with European deputy, avoiding the situation where American forces took orders from European superior. The experience of Montgomery commanding American forces in the Ardennes and the resulting controversy had demonstrated that national pride could not be completely subordinated to military efficiency even when allies shared strategic objectives. This lesson shaped Cold War military organization and persists in NATO structure today. The command arrangements at Selles, where pragmatic tactical commanders cooperated effectively while strategic commanders feuded, became a case study in how to handle coalition warfare's challenges. December 22, 1944, the day Eisenhower placed American forces under Montgomery's temporary command, was militarily necessary and politically toxic. The arrangement enabled rapid British response that helped contain the German breakthrough. It also created resentment that would affect Allied cooperation for the remainder of the war. At Selles, that arrangement meant British forces arrived first on Christmas Eve, while American forces arrived Christmas night and December 26th. This timing was decisive in preventing German withdrawal and enabling the methodical destruction that followed. Whether the same outcome would have occurred if American forces had been first to arrive, and British forces had provided follow-on support, is counterfactual speculation, but the actual sequence demonstrated that the command arrangement worked tactically, even as it failed politically. The soldiers who fought at Selles, American and British, generally respected each other's performance. The generals who commanded them, American and British, generally did not. That disparity between tactical cooperation and strategic conflict would characterize Allied operations through the war's final months. A legacy of the command controversy that the Ardennes crisis created, and that Selles illustrated in miniature. 1985, the village of Selles, Belgium, 40th anniversary of the battle. A reunion gathering brings together approximately 50 veterans, German, American, British, many meeting for the first time since December 1944, when they tried to kill each other. Werner Sternebeck, age 62, was a Panther tank driver in 2nd Panzer Division. He stands in the village square where his tank was destroyed 40 years earlier, speaking through an interpreter to an American veteran about the experience. "We knew on Christmas Eve we would never see Germany again," Sternebeck says. "The fuel gauge read empty. The radio said no relief was coming, though officially we were told to hold position. We were already dead. We just didn't stop moving yet." Across the square, British and American veterans compare notes about the battle, pointing at buildings, reconstructing the combat that destroyed them. The civilians of Selles have organized this reunion, believing the veterans deserve opportunity to find peace with their memories. Robert Harper was a tank commander in 2nd Armored Division's 66th Armored Regiment. His Sherman fought through Selles on December 26th, advancing building by building through German fire. In a letter home written 3 days after the battle, Harper described finding an abandoned German Panther, crew gone, interior showing signs of hasty evacuation. Personal items remained inside. Photographs of families, letters from home, someone's reading glasses. They looked just like us, Harper wrote. Young men far from home, fighting because someone told them to fight, dying in a place whose name they didn't know 3 days before they died there. The photographs in that tank could have been from my wallet. The letters could have been written by my mother. War makes us enemies, but we're not that different. Harper's letter, preserved by his family and later donated to the Army Heritage Center, captures the humanity that persisted even in brutal combat. Lieutenant James Cromwell commanded a troop of Cromwell tanks in British 3rd Royal Tank Regiment. His diary, kept throughout the war, despite regulations prohibiting such records, contains an entry from Christmas Day, 1944, while his tanks surrounded Selles preparing to attack the next morning. "Strange to be killing men on the day of Christ's birth," Cromwell wrote. "We can see them moving in the village below, preparing their defenses, knowing we will attack at dawn. They are professionals doing their job as we are professionals doing ours. I respect them for reaching this far, with the limited resources Germany still possesses. I will kill as many as I can tomorrow because that is my duty, but I take no pleasure in it. This is murder made respectable by uniform and orders. When the war ends, I shall remember these men in my prayers, especially those I personally killed." The diary, published posthumously in 1992, provided insight into the moral complexity experienced by soldiers even in justified wars. Marie Gendebien, the Belgian farmer's wife whose cellar sheltered both civilian families and wounded soldiers during the battle, testified about her experiences in multiple interviews through her long life. She died in 1998 at age 87, having spent her final decades ensuring that Selles' story was preserved. "The soldiers brought the war to us," she recalled in a 1987 interview. "We had no choice but to endure. German soldiers came first, polite but frightened, asking for shelter, warning us to stay in cellars during coming battle. British soldiers came after, also polite, also telling us to stay hidden. American soldiers came last, young men who looked surprised to find civilians in a war zone. We fed them when we could, bandaged their wounds regardless of uniform. They were all someone's sons. The war made them enemies. We pull them as human beings who needed help." Gendebien's testimony emphasized civilian perspective, often missing from military histories. German POW interrogations conducted immediately after the battle preserved testimony from soldiers while memories were fresh. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, Panther gunner, age 19, stated, "We advanced for 8 days believing we would reach the Meuse, cross it, continue to Antwerp. Officers told us success was possible if we moved fast and captured American fuel. On Christmas Eve we reached Selles, 5 kilometers from the Meuse, and realized we would go no further. No fuel to advance, no fuel to retreat, no relief column coming. We would fight from Selles until we died or surrendered. I had been in the Wehrmacht for 9 months, trained for 6 weeks before being assigned to 2nd Panzer Division as replacement. The veterans said this offensive was madness, that Germany could not win, that we were being sacrificed for Hitler's fantasy. They were correct. I surrendered on December 27 with no shame. Better prisoner than dead for lost cause." American combat medic Thomas Reardon, attached to 2nd Armored Division, described treating casualties during and after the Selles battle in oral history recorded in 1994. "The wounded kept coming throughout December 26th and 27th, Reardon recalled. Tank crews burned when their vehicles were hit, infantry with shrapnel wounds from artillery, men with frostbite from spending nights in foxholes in sub-zero temperatures. We treated them in a farmhouse that became our aid station, working by lamplight because we couldn't risk showing lights that would draw fire. The German wounded were brought in mixed with American wounded. We treated both. Medical ethics require treating enemy wounded same as friendly, but also, they were just young men in pain. One German soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, had both legs shattered by tank round. We gave him morphine, made him comfortable, knew he wouldn't survive. He asked me in broken English if I thought God would forgive him for killing people in unjust war. What do you say to that? I told him, God forgives everyone who asks. I don't know if I was right, but it seemed to comfort him. He died an hour later. British tank commander Michael Preston, whose Firefly killed 3 German Panthers at Selz, reflected on the battle in a 1996 interview conducted for BBC documentary. We had technical advantage in that specific situation, Preston explained. The 17-pounder gun on the Firefly could penetrate Panther frontal armor at ranges where their gun could also penetrate us, creating rough parity in firepower. But we had better position, firing from hull down on ridgeline while they were in the village below. We had unlimited ammunition. They were rationing every round. We had fuel to maneuver. They were stationary. The kills I achieved were not personal skill so much as material advantage. Given the same circumstances reversed, German gunners would have killed us just as easily. This is modern war. Industrial capacity matters more than individual bravery or skill. We were simply on the side with functioning industry and logistics. The 40th anniversary reunion in 1985 produced remarkable moments of reconciliation. Werner Sternebeck, the German Panther driver, met Robert Harper, the American tank commander whose unit destroyed Sternebeck's tank. The two men, speaking through interpreter, reconstructed the engagement, where each tank had been positioned, the sequence of shots fired, the moment Sternebeck's Panther was hit, and he escaped through the driver's hatch while his commander and gunner died inside. I hated Americans that day, Sternebeck said. You killed my friends, destroyed our tank. But I understand now you were doing your duty as I was doing mine. Neither of us chose this war. We were both victims of leaders who sent us to fight battles that should never have been fought. Harper responded, I thought of you as the enemy for 40 years. Meeting you as a person rather than a target in my gun sight changes my understanding of what we did. I'm glad you survived. I'm sorry I helped kill your crew. War is evil even when necessary. The veterans' perspectives evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, most focused on survival and return to normal life, avoiding discussion of combat experiences. In the 1960s and 70s, as America fought in Vietnam and public attitudes toward war became more skeptical, many World War II veterans began speaking more openly about combat's reality, the fear, the moral ambiguity, the psychological cost. By the 1980s and 90s, with the war 50 years past and many veterans reaching old age, there was urgency to record testimony before it was lost. The oral histories collected from Selle's veterans during this period are more honest and reflective than immediate post-war accounts, acknowledging the complexity of experiences that couldn't be reduced to simple heroic narratives. These late testimonies revealed that even in a good war fought against unambiguous evil, individual soldiers experienced moral doubt, psychological trauma, and permanent scars. Belgian civilians who lived through the battle maintained different relationship with its memory than the soldiers. For soldiers, Selle's was 2 days of intense combat followed by departure to other battles or return home. For civilians, Selle's was permanent home that had been destroyed and required rebuilding. The battle killed 23 Belgian civilians, approximately 8% of the village population. It destroyed or severely damaged 60% of buildings. The economic disruption lasted years. Farms couldn't operate while fields were mined and littered with unexploded ordnance. Livestock had been killed or scattered. Winter supplies had been consumed or destroyed. The Marshall Plan assistance that rebuilt Western Europe after the war helped Selle's recover physically, but the psychological impact persisted for generations. Children who experienced the battle suffered nightmares for years. Adults who lost family members or homes carried grief permanently. The village was rebuilt by 1950, but it was never quite the same community it had been before December 1944. The final testament of the Selle's veterans came in their wills and estate planning. Multiple veterans from all 3 nations left bequests to maintain the Selle's memorial or fund educational programs about the battle. Werner Sternebeck left portion of his estate to establish scholarship for Belgian students studying history, specifically requesting the fund honor civilians who suffered in the battle. Robert Harper donated his wartime correspondence and photographs to the U.S. Army Heritage Center with stipulation that they be used to educate future soldiers about combat's reality. James Cromwell's published diary proceeds went to British veterans organizations supporting soldiers with post-traumatic stress. These bequests represented veterans' desire that their experiences not be forgotten, that future generations learn from what happened at Celles, that the dead, military and civilian, be remembered with dignity. The voices from the pocket, German soldiers who advanced to their doom, Allied soldiers who destroyed them, civilians who endured the violence, all testified to war's complexity and cost. Their testimonies, preserved through reunions, interviews, diaries, and letters, ensured that Celles would not be completely forgotten, even if it never achieved the fame of Bastogne. 24. The village of Celles, Belgium. 80 years after the battle, a military historian stands on the ridgeline north of the village, where British tanks positioned themselves on Christmas Day, 1944. She holds a tablet computer displaying satellite imagery overlaid with historical maps showing unit positions during the battle. The modern village below looks peaceful. Rebuilt farmhouses, cultivated fields, the church steeple rising above surrounding buildings. Traffic passes on the road toward Dinant, 5 kilometers west, the road that 2nd Panzer Division never reached. The historian is constructing a digital reconstruction of the battle for educational purposes, using GPS coordinates to mark where each tank was destroyed, where each unit attacked, attempting to preserve the battlefield's geography before development erases remaining traces. As she works, she considers the fundamental question that haunts Celles. What if the Germans had succeeded? What if 2nd Panzer Division had crossed the Meuse River? The alternate history scenario requires changing only a few variables. If Germany had possessed adequate fuel to sustain the offensive as planned, 2nd Panzer Division would have reached the Meuse with enough operational tanks to force a crossing. The Dinant bridges were defended on December 24th by a single American engineer company and scattered rear echelon units, inadequate to stop a determined armor assault. A German bridgehead west of the Meuse, established before British reserves arrived, would have created fundamentally different operational situation. Allied forces would have needed to conduct river crossing in reverse, attacking across the Meuse from west to east to eliminate the bridgehead. This is one of warfare's most difficult operations, requiring specialized equipment, careful preparation, substantial resources. Success was likely given Allied material superiority, but it would have taken time, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks rather than the 2 days actually required to destroy the isolated force at Celles. Military historians conducting systematic analysis of the alternate scenario generally conclude that German Meuse crossing would not have changed the war's ultimate outcome, but could have delayed it significantly. 2 to 3 weeks eliminating a German bridgehead west of the Meuse would have delayed Allied counteroffensive operations by similar duration. The planned Allied Rhine crossing, originally scheduled for March 1945, might have been delayed to April or May. This would have given Germany additional weeks to strengthen Rhine defenses, to attempt political negotiations with Western allies, to inflict additional casualties on Allied forces. The strategic calculation remains that Germany could not win the war. Material disparities were too great, Allied air superiority too complete, Soviet pressure from east too overwhelming. But Germany might have prolonged the war by several weeks or months, with corresponding increases in casualties and destruction. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. If the Ardennes Offensive had delayed Allied operations by 2 months, the war might have ended in July, with perhaps 50,000 additional Allied casualties and hundreds of thousands of additional German military and civilian deaths. The fuel calculation that doomed 2nd Panzer Division reveals how close the alternate scenario came to reality. The division needed approximately 10,000 additional liters of fuel to reach the Meuse and establish bridgehead. This represents fuel for approximately 50 tanks to travel 20 kilometers and fight for several hours. In the context of World War II fuel consumption, Germany using millions of liters daily at the offensive's peak, 10,000 liters is trivial amount. If German supply columns had delivered that additional fuel to 2nd Panzer Division on December 23rd or 24th, the tactical situation changes completely. This demonstrates the razor-thin margins on which major historical events sometimes turn. 10,000 liters of gasoline, amount that could fit in 20 medium-sized trucks, amount that represents less than 1% of daily German fuel consumption, was the difference between German forces being stopped at Celles versus crossing the Meuse, and fundamentally changing the campaign's operational character. The weather variable adds another layer to alternate history analysis. Allied air power was grounded from December 16th through 23rd by fog, clouds, and poor visibility. This 7-day window enabled the German advance by preventing Allied air interdiction of supply columns and close air support for ground forces. The weather cleared on December 24th, and Allied aircraft immediately began devastating attacks on German logistics. If the weather had remained bad for 3 additional days, until December 27th, 2nd Panzer Division's supply columns might have reached Celles without being destroyed by air attack. The fuel that burned on roads east of Celles might instead have reached the spearhead units. Again, a small variable, 3 days of continued bad weather rather than clearing, creates fundamentally different outcome. Weather cannot be controlled or predicted perfectly, but it played a decisive role in determining the Ardennes Offensive's failure. The Allied reserve positioning, specifically Montgomery's placement of British X-Corps to guard Meuse crossings, represents the decisive human decision that prevented German success, even if fuel and weather had favored them. Montgomery has been criticized for excessive caution throughout the campaign, for slow movements and careful preparation that sometimes missed operational opportunities. But at the Meuse in December 1944, his caution was precisely what the situation required. By positioning British 29th Armored Brigade at Ciney, 60 kilometers from Dinant, but able to deploy quickly to any threatened crossing point, Montgomery created the mobile reserve that could respond to German breakthrough before it reached the river. If British reserves had been positioned further back, at Brussels for instance, where many staff officers thought they would be safer from sudden German attack, they could not have reached Chelles before 2nd Panzer Division crossed the Meuse. Montgomery's professional judgment about defensive positioning proved more valuable than any amount of offensive dash would have been in that specific circumstance. Modern Celles provides few visible traces of the battle that defined its history. The memorial stone in the village center marks the event with simple inscription listing dates and participants. A small museum in the village hall displays photographs, maps, and artifacts collected by local historical society. The fields where tanks fought are cultivated farmland, showing no sign of combat except a trained eye that recognizes subtle terrain features where defensive positions were located. Occasional battlefield archaeology occurs when construction projects uncover shell fragments, equipment pieces, or unexploded ordnance requiring careful removal. But the landscape has largely healed, nature and human reconstruction erasing the scars. This physical erasure of battle's traces mirrors the historical erasure of battle's memory, both processes gradually making Celles indistinguishable from hundreds of other European villages that experienced World War II combat. The annual commemoration ceremony at Celles, held each December 26th, has evolved over the decades. In the immediate post-war years, hundreds attended, including many veterans and families of the fallen. By the 21st century, attendance had declined to perhaps 200, mostly local Belgians and military history enthusiasts, with only a handful of surviving veterans able to travel. The ceremony follows standard format: wreath laying at memorial, speeches by local officials and military representatives, moment of silence, sometimes period music performed by school band. The tone is respectful but increasingly distant, commemorating events that have passed from living memory into history. Younger generations of Celles residents know the battle occurred, can point to the memorial stone, understand that their village was historically significant for a brief moment. But the emotional connection has attenuated. The battle is history, not living memory. The Cold War legacy of Celles influenced NATO doctrine more than the battle's direct participants realized. When NATO planners in the 1950s and 60s developed strategies for defending Western Europe against potential Soviet attack, they studied the Ardennes Offensive extensively as example of breakthrough scenario. The lessons extracted from Celles specifically included importance of use, maintaining mobile armored reserves capable of rapid deployment to threatened sectors, necessity of pre-positioned fuel and ammunition stocks to sustain those reserves without vulnerable supply lines, critical value of air power against enemy logistics once weather permits operations, and requirement for integrated command structure, allowing rapid coordination between forces of different nationalities. These lessons shaped NATO force structure, with armored divisions positioned to respond to breakthroughs, massive pre-positioned equipment stocks stored in Europe, air forces configured for interdiction missions, and command arrangements enabling multinational cooperation. The ghost of what might have been at Celles. German breakthrough succeeding instead of failing, haunted NATO planning throughout the Cold War. The strategic analysis of why Germany lost the Ardennes Offensive, with Celles as the specific point of failure, reveals fundamental truth about industrial-age warfare. Germany possessed superior technology in many categories: better tanks, better anti-tank guns, tactical proficiency born of years of combat experience. But Germany lacked the industrial capacity and logistical infrastructure to sustain operations that superior technology enabled. The Panthers that reached Celles were excellent tanks, but Germany could produce perhaps 300 monthly, while America produced 2,000 Shermans monthly. German synthetic fuel plants, even before Allied bombing destroyed them, could never produce enough fuel to support extended mechanized operations. German logistics, dependent on railroads that were being systematically destroyed by air attacks, could not maintain supply lines as they extended. The arithmetic was inescapable. Superior technology without adequate logistics enabled initial success, but guaranteed ultimate failure. This lesson, learned definitively at Celles, would be studied by military planners worldwide for decades afterward. The human cost of the Ardennes Offensive, with Celles as one of hundreds of engagements that comprised it, reminds us that strategic calculations abstract real suffering. Approximately 600 German soldiers participated in the Battle of Celles. 150 died, 450 became prisoners, 20 escaped. Those numbers represent 600 individual human beings, sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, whose lives were ended or permanently altered by 2 days of combat in a Belgian village. The Allied casualties at Celles, 140 killed and wounded, represent similar individual tragedies multiplied by families who lost loved ones or welcomed home men permanently scarred by combat. The Belgian civilians, 23 killed, hundreds traumatized, add further layer of human cost. When historians debate whether the offensive could have succeeded with different fuel allocations or weather conditions, they are implicitly debating whether these specific deaths were necessary or could have been avoided, whether additional deaths might have occurred if the battle had lasted longer or been fought at different location. The final reflection on Celles must acknowledge what we cannot know. History records what happened, but the alternate possibilities, what might have happened, remain speculation informed by analysis but unprovable by evidence. If 2nd Panzer Division had crossed the Meuse, would the war have been significantly prolonged? Probably by weeks, possibly by months, unlikely by years. Would German success have encouraged Hitler to continue the war even longer, rejecting surrender even as Germany collapsed? Possibly. Would additional Allied casualties have affected post-war political settlements, perhaps reducing American public support for European commitments? Speculatively. These questions multiply endlessly, each assumption leading to further branching possibilities. What we know is what happened. 2nd Panzer Division reached Celles, was trapped, and was destroyed. Hitler's last offensive failed. The war in Europe ended 5 months later. The world that emerged from that ending shaped the remainder of the 20th century in ways that alternate outcomes might have changed unpredictably. Today, December 22nd, 2025, 81 years after the battle, the view from Celles Church Tower, unchanged in 8 decades, looks west toward Dinant and the Meuse River Valley, 5 kilometers distant. On clear day, you can see the valley that 2nd Panzer Division never reached. The distance is short enough to walk in an hour, close enough that German reconnaissance could observe Allied traffic on the roads. It is also the distance that measured Germany's failure, the gap between Hitler's fantasy and historical reality, the space where the Ardennes Offensive died, and with it, Germany's last hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. The ghost of what might have been, breakthrough, river crossing, campaign prolonged, additional deaths, alternate history, haunts that 5-kilometer gap. But ghosts cannot change what happened, only remind us that history turns on small margins. 10,000 liters of fuel, 3 days of weather, 60 kilometers of British positioning, 5 kilometers that prove 5 too many. Celles stands as testament to those margins, visible to those who look for it, forgotten by those who don't. A small Belgian village that witnessed the end of Hitler's Third Reich's offensive capability, and became, for 2 days in December 1944, the most strategically important location in Western Europe. That importance has faded into history, but the lessons remain for those willing to learn. Logistics defeats technology, industrial capacity trumps tactical skill, and wars are won not by reaching the furthest extent of advance, but by sustaining operations until objectives are achieved. Germany learned these lessons too late. The fields around Celles, quiet and cultivated, mark where that education became final and irreversible.